Hey guys, tonight we're following a man who lived in a wine jar, barked at senators, and told Alexander the Great to get out of the sunlight. Diogenes didn't just reject society, he wagged his tail at it, scratched himself in public, and let's just say he took care of his personal urges right there in the town square without a hint of shame. So, while you're getting comfortable, feel free to tap like and subscribe if this kind of calm, late night history is your thing. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it was when you pressed play. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stone is warm where you press your back against it, but the wind off the Acropolis doesn't care. It slides between folds of your ragged cloak like a thief, tugging at the last threads of comfort you still bother to keep. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a hollowed-out wine jar, battered, sun-bleached, and nestled into the dusty slope outside the city walls. You didn't choose it for shelter. You chose it for the irony. In a city where men chase luxury like hungry dogs, you've wrapped your arms around a clay stomach that once held the drink of kings, and now holds a man who would rather bite than beg. Your skin is cracked, your beard tangled, your stomach almost always empty, and yet, lying here in the half-dark, you feel richer than the fools arguing about justice just a few steps away. Athens buzzes even at night. You hear the clop of sandals on marble, laughter leaking out of upper-story windows, and someone haggling with a prostitute near the olive stalls. Your lamp burned out hours ago, but you're not done thinking. You rarely are. There's something about the night sky that reminds you how silly everyone looks in daylight, flapping their tongues, worrying about their sandals, measuring their lives by the price of oil and the width of their cloaks. You scratch your knees through the thin fabric and wonder whether any of them have ever really lived. Not talked about life, not written about it in long scrolls, not painted it on urns or carved it into speeches, but lived, really lived. You smile to yourself, lips cracked, because you know the answer. You've seen it in their faces when they pass by your jar. They don't know whether to pity you or fear you. Sometimes they stop to stare. Occasionally, one tosses you a crust of bread or asks what you're doing, squatting there like some dirty statue carved from the same dust you sit on. You tell them you're practicing freedom. They never understand. How could they? Their freedom comes with a key and a lock. Yours doesn't even need a door. You have no roof but the sky, no walls but the wind. Your only companion is the dog that curls at your feet, ribs rising and falling in rhythm with your own. He doesn't talk, doesn't judge, doesn't ask what school of philosophy you belong to. He just lies there, occasionally sniffing at your elbow when the night grows cold. And that, you think, is more honest than any dialogue written by Plato. You shift your weight to the other hip. The jar's curve is never comfortable, but you've long since stopped caring. What matters is the view. From here, you can see the torchlight along the city gates, the flicker of oil lamps in the homes of men who dream they own something. You own nothing, and so nothing owns you. You tried to explain that once to a merchant who asked why you didn't want a proper house. He laughed, offered you a job sweeping floors, said you'd be warm. You told him dogs don't sweep, they just bark. That ended the conversation quickly. People always find it harder to argue with a man who refuses to play the game. Your stomach growls. You let it. Hunger is part of the experiment. If you want to live apart from society, you have to let go of what society uses to keep you chained. Comfort, approval, routine. You've let go of all of them, one by one, like a man tossing stones out of his own pockets until he floats. They call you mad. You've heard worse. But you're not mad. You're awake. You hear everything. The creak of carts in the distance, the rustle of robes on stone, even the soft, barely there sound of rats chewing at the edges of a forgotten stall. The world is always talking. Most people just drown it out with coin counting and philosophy. You listen. Sleep doesn't come easily, but that's fine. You never trusted dreams. Too much like illusions. And you've made it your life's work to tear illusions apart. The jar creaks slightly as you shift again, staring at the stars through the hole in your cloak where a button once was. You try to count them, not to measure them like an astronomer might, but to remember that you're part of something no scroll could ever describe. You've pissed on scrolls before, in fact. That usually clears the lecture halls in a hurry. In the distance, a dog howls. Yours lifts his head, then settles again. You smile, knowing the bark wasn't a warning. Just a message. I'm still here. You close your eyes briefly, breathing in the cool air that smells faintly of olives, dust, and donkey dung. You wonder what those fools in the Agra are arguing about tonight. Justice? Temperance? The soul? You'll find out soon enough. Morning is creeping into the sky like a thief with sandals made of mist, and you know that when the market opens, you'll be there to greet it barefoot, with sarcasm in your teeth and onions in your bag. The sun hits your eyelids before your thoughts can. It's not gentle. There's no curtain to dull it, no servant to wake you with a tray of watered wine and figs. Just the sudden, hot brightness pushing past your brow, chasing the dampness from your cloak, and daring you to open your eyes. You do, reluctantly, blinking at the skies in different blue, and stretch your legs outside the jar. The clay walls press against your ribs as you twist free, bones cracking like kindling after a cold night. The ground is dry beneath your feet, baked into a powder that sticks to your skin like a second, grittier layer of clothing. You take a breath, scratch yourself, and start walking toward the Agra without bothering to shake the dirt off. It cakes under your toenails with each step, a soft crunch as you cross the stones and press into the hot dust between them. You feel it wedge into every crevice of your soul, gritty, grounding, unavoidably real. That's the point. Sandals protect you from the earth. You don't want protection. You want contact. You want to remember that you're an animal first and a philosopher second, maybe even third. Your cloak is damp with last night's sweat, but you don't change it. It's the only one you have, and besides, what would be the point? A clean garment on a dirty body just feels dishonest. You tie the knot at your shoulder and keep moving, every few steps letting out a theatrical grunt, just to see who turns their head. The Agra is already loud. Merchants are shouting about fish and figs. Politicians are sharpening their speeches like knives, and philosophers lean against pillars, trying to sound wiser than they feel. You pass a group of men discussing moderation, while eyeing a pastry stall like starving children. One of them recognizes you. He narrows his eyes, shifts his toga, and turns away. You smile. He probably still remembers the time you peed in front of the academy's gates, muttering something about how even bladder functions obey nature more than Plato's syllogisms. You wander through the market slowly, savoring the noises, the smells, the unfiltered mess of life. A woman selling onions gives you a suspicious look as you grab one, bite straight through it, and then toss her a few pebbles from your pouch in payment. She doesn't protest. She's learned it's easier to let you be than to argue. The juice stings your gums, burns your throat in the way you've come to appreciate. Onion for breakfast. Or lunch. You don't really track time anymore. The sun is high, the air is thick, and you haven't been arrested yet. That's enough of a schedule. A boy with curly hair and clean hands walks past you carrying scrolls. His sandals look new. He doesn't meet your eyes. You bark at him. Just once. Sharp and sudden like a dog surprised mid-nap. He jumps and drops a scroll. You pick it up, glance at the title, something about virtue, and hand it back to him with a solemn nod. He who learns from paper forgets the taste of wind, you mutter. He runs off. You cackle, nearly choking on the last bite of onion. There's a corner of the Agra you like, just beside the fountain where pigeons gather to drink and the philosophers gather to posture. You sit on a warm step, and spread your legs wide, letting your knees point east and west as if trying to measure the world in the shape of your discomfort. A breeze lifts your cloak slightly, revealing a patch of skin most Athenians would prefer stayed hidden. You don't bother covering up. If the gods didn't want us to see it, you figure they wouldn't have made it so easy. A group of schoolboys passes by, laughing behind their hands. One dares the other to speak to you. He approaches cautiously, eyes darting around to make sure no adults are watching. "Are you really Diogenes?" he asks. You wipe your nose on your forearm and nod. "Yes, and you're really wasting your youth worrying about that." His friend bursts out laughing. The boy frowns and walks away, muttering something about crazy old men. You shout after him. "At least this crazy old man doesn't beg for approval." That earns you a few chuckles from a nearby fish vendor. You've become something of a fixture here, part philosopher, part performance, part public nuisance. People never quite know what to make of you, and that's your favorite part. They try to fit you into a category. Lunatic, wise man, beggar, clown. But every time they think they've figured you out, you do something that doesn't make sense to them. That's the game. That's the lesson. You are a walking contradiction with dirty feet and a clean conscience, and it drives them mad. You stand again, stretch your arms until your back pops, and continue your slow march through the sun-baked square. A merchant offers you a peach if you promise to leave his stall alone. You take the peach, then lean on his table and begin a loud, rambling critique of luxury. He glares. You shrug. The peach is good, sweet, sticky, almost insulting in how pleasant it tastes. You wipe your mouth with the back of your hand and drop the pit at your feet. As you make your way toward the temple steps, a familiar voice calls out your name, half curious, half weary. It's the same Athenian scholar you embarrassed last week during his lecture on logic. He's gesturing now to a few of his students, clearly hoping to use you as a living example of moral failure. You grin and head toward him, cracking your knuckles and clearing your throat. Time to bark again, in more ways than one. You're already mid-step when the conversation starts. The young students in their clean tunics part nervously as you approach, as if poverty might be contagious if it breathes too close. Their teacher, a man whose hairline recedes with every new scroll he writes, forces a smile onto his face and opens his arms as if he's welcoming you to a polite debate. "Diogenes," he says, loud enough to gather attention, "tell us, what is the nature of virtue?" You don't stop walking. Instead, you drop to all fours, pant once, and let out a long guttural bark. The students recoil. One lets out a startled laugh. The teacher does not. "Must we always perform?" He mutters, exasperated, as though you've disappointed him by not launching into a lecture. You finally stop and stand, scratching your chest absently. "Ah, but I did answer," you say, smirking. "I gave you an honest reaction to a dishonest question." You pluck a grape from a nearby stall, without asking, pop it into your mouth, and look around at the small crowd that's gathered. Attention, it seems, is the one thing everyone here is desperate to have, and the one thing you could not care less about. Still, there's something satisfying about disrupting their little rituals. You've spent enough time observing these so-called wise men to know that most of their knowledge smells faintly of warmed-over olives and borrowed conclusions. They quote each other like it's prayer, nod solemnly at syllogisms, and cling to definitions as if virtue can be boxed, labeled, and passed around like dried herbs. You prefer a different method. Strike, mock, confuse, and see what remains. If their ideas can't survive a little ridicule, they probably weren't ideas to begin with, just decorations. You squat beside the marble column, where the philosopher's group had hoped to set up their lesson for the day. He's still speaking, attempting to reframe the conversation, something about the importance of rational order in society. You yawn dramatically, then reach for a stick nearby and begin drawing circles in the dust. A boy leans forward to watch. you draw a chicken. Then you scratch it out and draw a sandal. Then you draw a coin and spit on it. There, you say to no one in particular. That's the order of society. Food, fashion, fraud. The older philosopher clears his throat. You mock what you do not understand. You look up at him with a half-lidded stare and murmur, "No, I mock what I understand all too well." That's the problem. The boy beside you giggles. One of the other students tries to hide his smile. The man walks away in a huff, robes billowing like they've taken offense on his behalf. You watch him go, then flick some dust at his footprints. The boy beside you says, "My father says you're insane." You shrug. Your father wears rings on his fingers and needs 3 servants to tie his sandals. Who's insane? You spend the next hour wandering between groups of thinkers and shoppers, letting loose the occasional bark, a crude joke, a pointed observation. One man sits beside a statue of Athena, arguing that desire must be tamed like a horse. You interrupt him by miming riding an invisible steed, hooting and hollering until his audience drifts away. Another group tries to ignore you as you loudly discuss the philosophical implications of flatulence. If nature does it, is it not divine? You ask a passing priest, who trips over his own feet trying to get away. But you don't only bark at the robed and educated. You turn toward the beggars too. Not out of cruelty, never that, but out of solidarity mixed with provocation. One sits beside a crumbling wall with his hand outstretched, eyes dull with hunger and defeat. You sit beside him, mirror his posture, and start barking loudly at passers-by. "Give me food," you growl. "Give me oil. Give me sandals for my delicate feet." People look over, startled, unsure if it's a performance or a crime. Eventually, someone tosses a fig, which you let bounce off your chest before handing it to the beggar. He stares at you, confused. "Why?" he asks. You reply, "Because you asked quietly, and I barked like I meant it." A merchant with an apron full of bruised dates leans over and mutters, "You're cruel, Diogenes." You shake your head. Cruel is telling a man to suffer with dignity. I say make noise. Shame the gods. Force them to feed you. The merchant doesn't answer. He just turns away, muttering about madness. You hear that word a lot. Sometimes you even believe it. But most of the time, you think the world is mad, and you're simply the only one howling the truth. By the time the sun begins to drop behind the western hills, you're hoarse from barking, and your feet are black with dust. You retreat toward the edge of the square, trailing the scent of roasted garlic and the sticky stain of crushed fruit on your cloak. A group of children plays near the fountain, splashing each other and daring one another to touch the statue of Apollo. One of them spots you, points, and barks. The others laugh, joining in. You nod once, approving. Let them start early. The market begins to thin. Philosophers pack their scrolls. Merchants sweep the stone paths. You take a moment to rest on a low step and feel the last heat of the day radiating up from the marble. A thin woman with arms like tree branches sits down a few paces away and opens a cloth to reveal a handful of wilted greens. You recognize her. She used to be the wife of a rich man. Now she's just another shadow on the street. You nod at her, and she nods back. Neither of you speaks. There's no need. You watch as a stray dog licks water from the base of a cracked amphora. You wonder if it's the same dog you shared a bone with last week. Hard to tell. They blur together, those dogs, free in a way men can't seem to manage. You stand again, brushing crumbs from your cloak, and make your way slowly toward the edge of the city. The sun is dipping lower now, and the last conversations in the square fade into the hum of evening. The day has given you enough mischief to digest, and maybe, if you're lucky, another chance to challenge decency before night falls completely. You glance down at your feet, at the dirt embedded deep into your skin, and smile. It's not filth, It's proof. Proof that you walked where others only talked. And in the fading light, you think it's time for a different kind of lesson. Not just in words, but in acts most would never dare perform in public. The late day heat bakes the stone beneath your feet, warming your ankles with a slow, creeping insistence that feels almost affectionate, like the city trying to hug you with its elbows. You scratch it a bite on your neck, then drag your cloak aside, squat beside the nearest column, and relieve yourself with the serenity of a man watering a plant. A pair of women across the street gasp, covering their mouths with the backs of their hands, their sandals clicking faster as they scurry away. You raise your eyebrows at them with mock concern and wave lazily. "Don't worry," you call out. "I'm not doing anything nature hasn't already approved." There was a time, brief, forgettable, when such a thing might have bothered you. But somewhere between being laughed at, insulted, and nearly arrested for chewing bones at a sacred altar, you made peace with the way people see you. Or rather, the way they fail to. You're not really a man to them anymore. You're a warning, a spectacle, a cracked mirror they'd rather look away from. And still, you don't hide. You do the opposite. You make them watch. You once told a student that shame is just fear dressed in a tunic. People learn it young, how to cover, bow, stammer, apologize for existing too loudly. You unlearned it on purpose. Shame, you say, is a leash disguised as a virtue. It keeps people in line, yes, but it also keeps them from living. So now, every time you pull back your cloak to scratch your thigh in public or bathe naked in the fountain near the temple, it's not for spectacle. It's a sermon, a very undignified, very effective sermon. Today, you've decided to deliver it with special flair. You march back into the agro with your head high, your cloak barely clinging to one shoulder, and your face alight with a kind of mischief that only the truly unafraid can wear. You spot a small crowd forming near the steps where a minor official is giving a speech about civic order. You stride up beside him, fold your arms, and begin loudly commenting on the absurdity of order in a city where people pretend virtue means wearing sandals and speaking softly. A man who tiptoes around his own desires, you announce to no one in particular, might as well live with his head inside a scroll. A few bystanders laugh. Others shuffle uncomfortably. One man, clearly irritated, glares at you and mutters, "Have you no shame?" You pause, look him in the eye, and say with absolute sincerity, "None. I flushed it down the same gutter that carries your principles." You pat the dog at your side and toss him a bit of old bread as a reward for staying through the lecture. But the true lesson of the day hasn't begun yet. That comes a few moments later, when you drop your cloak entirely and begin scratching at a rash on your hip with the same casual intensity a cat might use when licking its paws. The crowd parts like a startled flock of birds. Some curse. One older man throws a pebble at your feet and shouts, "You disgrace the city." You stand, arms open, completely bare, and shout back, "Then perhaps the city should ask why it built its dignity so close to where a man urinates." A woman gasps. A boy stifles a laugh. The official tries to continue speaking, his voice shaking slightly. You turn, bend down, and begin miming the act of washing your armpits with invisible water, whistling a little tune as you do. It's performance, yes, but not for applause. It's for disruption, for disarming the pompous and reminding them that beneath their robes and theories, they're animals pretending not to have bodies. Eventually, a guard appears, not the serious kind, just a sleepy young man in armor 2 sizes too big, clearly hoping not to make eye contact. He approaches slowly, looks at your face, then at the ground, then at the crowd. "Diogenes," he says quietly, "I'm supposed to ask you to put your clothes back on." You nod thoughtfully, then drape the cloak over your shoulder with exaggerated elegance and strike a pose. "Behold," you declare, "I am once again a man of society." The guard sighs and walks away. The crowd disperses. You sit back down on the steps, swiping the sweat from your forehead with your forearm, and take a moment to enjoy the slight breeze drifting up from the harbor. It's faint, carrying hints of salt and fish and the musty scent of old amphorie, but it's enough to remind you that the world is always bigger than the lecture hall. Your dog returns, flopping down beside you with a yawn. You scratch behind his ears, and he leans into your side, just as another passerby throws you a look of disgust. Does it exhaust you? You murmur aloud, not to your dog, but to the invisible crowd that lives in your memory. To be so constantly offended? You look around. There's no answer. Just the sun settling lower, the agra quieting, and the warm stone beneath your bare legs humming with life. You shift slightly to the side, feel a pebble dig into your skin, and let out a slow sigh of contentment. You're not comfortable, but you're free, and that matters more. Somewhere across the square, you see another philosopher, one of Plato's students, gesturing in frustration at a group of listeners. He's clearly losing control of the conversation, and you can't resist. You stand again, pat your dog, and start making your way toward him. Because while some philosophers speak of truth, you prefer to walk straight into it with your feet in the dust and a half-eaten onion in your hand. You cradle the lamp in your hands like it's an oracle's gift, though there's no mystery in its flicker. It's midday, and the sun burns high and strong above the rooftops, bleaching the marble and casting sharp-edged shadows across the agora. You walk directly into that sunlight with your lamp held high, flames sputtering slightly as it competes with the sky. "What are you doing?" someone asks. You don't answer. You just keep walking. Your feet leave prints in the dust. Your cloak sways behind you, and your face is locked in that half-smirk, half-glower expression that people have come to associate with trouble. The first merchant you pass snorts. "Trying to sell fire in daylight, Diogenes?" You glance at him without breaking stride. "Trying to find a man," you say, "an honest one." The merchant laughs until he realizes you're serious. His smile twitches, then dies. You leave him there, suddenly unsure if he's been included in the accusation. Of course he has. That's the whole point. It's not a performance today, not exactly. The barking, the peeing, the public scolding of students, that's entertainment with a bite. This, though, is quieter, more confusing. You walk with the lamp through crowded streets, down narrow alleys where bronzesmiths hammer in rhythm, past wide-open doorways where aristocrats recline in shade and gossip about matters that don't matter. And everywhere you go, you ask the same thing. Have you seen an honest man? Reactions vary. Some pretend not to hear. Others frown, then smile awkwardly. One young woman points at her husband and says, "He's honest." The man glares at her. You shake your head. If he needs you to vouch for him, he's already failed the test. You keep moving. A group of young philosophers lounges under the olive trees, quoting Socrates with the polished confidence of men who've never gone a day hungry. You approach them slowly, lamp held close to your chest now, like a flame you're guarding from a storm that hasn't arrived yet. "Tell me," you say, "are you honest?" They chuckle, thinking it's a joke, and one replies, "More honest than most." You raise your eyebrows. Is that like being more pregnant than most? They fall silent. One tries to pivot the conversation to ethics. You yawn and walk away. You pause near the steps of the temple of Hephaestus. A priest stands there, brushing dust from his ceremonial robes, preparing to light incense for an offering. You watch him for a long moment before asking, "Have you ever lied to yourself?" The question lands differently here. He hesitates. His eyes flicker to the lamp, then to the gods above. "Every man lies to himself," he says quietly. You nod, just once, and move on. Maybe that was honest, or maybe it was just clever. You're not sure yet. The sun glints off the rooftops now, and sweat clings to the hollow of your back. The lamp grows hot in your fingers. Still you carry it. Still you ask. You pass a child chewing on a fig, face smeared with juice. Are you honest? You ask. He blinks up at you, shrugs, and offers you the rest of the fruit. You take it. No words, no performance. Just the pure, thoughtless honesty of a small act. You nod solemnly and press the fig to your lips like a ritual offering. It's overripe, sticky, and perfect. Eventually, you return to your favorite corner of the agora, the one just beneath the chipped statue of a forgotten statesman whose nose was probably broken off in protest. You sit, lamp resting on your knee, and stare at the people moving through the square. So many faces, so many masks. You think about all the men who lecture about truth, the women who perform modesty like it's a dance, the priests who speak for gods they've never seen. You wonder if any of them ever stop to ask what they're hiding beneath all that polish. Not just from others, but from themselves. A man approaches you cautiously, mid-30s, stiff posture, probably a clerk or a scribe, someone who spends too much time copying the thoughts of men braver than he is. He clears his throat and says, "I've heard of you. I think I'd like to learn." You gesture to the ground beside you. He hesitates, then sits. You hold the lamp toward him. Do you lie to yourself? He considers it. Sometimes, he admits, but I try not to. You nod. That's closer than most. The two of you sit in silence for a while, watching the marketplace unfold like a badly rehearsed play. Someone slips on a melon rind. A horse relieves itself near the pottery stall. A boy steals a piece of flatbread and runs, laughing as the baker curses after him. All of it, the beauty, the grime, the ridiculousness. It all belongs to the same city, the same theater, the same lie. But then again, maybe that's what makes it worth watching. You lean back, stretch your legs, and let the lamp's flame sputter out against the afternoon wind. The smoke rises briefly, curling like a question you don't need to answer. You hand the lamp to the scribe. "Keep it," you say. "You'll need it when the sun goes down, and everyone starts pretending they know who they are." He takes it with a strange mix of reverence and confusion. You don't explain. You rarely do. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings. The crowd shifts. People head toward the baths, the temples, the slow glide of dinner and gossip. You watch them go, your hands now empty, your thoughts humming. The honest man you searched for hasn't appeared, but you found a fig, a silence, and a moment of truth, or something close to it. That's enough for today. And maybe, just maybe, the dogs are getting hungry again. They'll be waiting by the temple steps, bones in the dust, and eyes shining with something like understanding. You rise slowly, joints creaking, and start walking in that direction. They greet you before you even turn the corner. 3 mutts, ribs visible beneath patchy fur, noses twitching at the smell of your cloak more than anything you might be carrying. One of them barks, once short and low. Another wags its tail and trots over, sniffing at your feet with cautious optimism. The third just stares, ears tilted back, like he's waiting to see if you've brought wisdom or scraps. You drop to a crouch, pat your chest, and let them approach. There's nothing ceremonial about it. This is dinner, and you're not above sharing. You've gathered a handful of cast-offs from the market. Half a fig, a bruised onion, a crust of bread so stale it might count as a weapon. You tear the bread into uneven pieces and toss them into the dirt. The dogs pounce without hesitation, growling only slightly, more out of habit than real hostility. You join them, grimy knees in the dust, biting into your portion of the bread like it's a feast. A crumb catches in your beard. You leave it there. Let the flies find it first. The sun is almost gone now, casting long shadows between the columns and making the city feel older, somehow quieter. A few passers-by glance at the scene, some with disgust, others with pity, and one or two with a strange kind of envy they'll never admit. You've noticed that look before. The way people sometimes stare at you, like they wish they could be you, just for an hour, just to be unburdened. But they won't. They can't. Their sandals are too clean, their homes too full, their lives too carefully arranged. You, on the other hand, eat in the dirt with creatures who never lie to themselves. And that, you think, is the most honest table in Athens. You lick your fingers, wipe them on your cloak, and lie back against the warm stone. The dogs settle beside you, one resting its head on your ankle, the others curled in the dust. You listen to their breathing, slow, even untroubled. They don't care about virtue. They don't debate moderation. They live, they eat, they sleep. And yet somehow, they've understood more about nature than all the men in the academy combined. The breeze shifts. You can smell roasted meat drifting up from the upper quarter, where the wealthy are reclining on cushions, their servants pouring wine. You imagine them discussing you again. That madman in the marketplace, they'll say. The one who barks like a dog and squats in the street. And you'll let them. Because tomorrow, you'll be back underfoot again, tripping up their ideas with questions they don't want to answer. You close your eyes, just for a moment, and rest your hand on the flank of the nearest mutt. His side rises and falls beneath your palm, steady and warm. The street quiets. The marble cools. And soon, the stories that follow you will turn toward the legends, the moments that will echo in the courts and scrolls long after your bones are forgotten. But before we arrive at those tales, with their kings and insults and philosophies turned into performance, we have to follow you just a little further, to the day you met a man named Alexander. You've never trusted the shine of coins. They feel dishonest in the hand, thin, bright, overconfident things stamped with the faces of men who pay sculptors to make them look like gods. Your father handled them with care, the way a mason might lift a sacred stone, shaping images into value with practiced movements and polished molds. You learned how to balance them, how to weigh their worth, how to detect the tiny scratches that turn silver into fraud. But while he taught you to honor the currency, he never taught you to question the idea behind it, the faith people invest in metal and symbols, and the strange fear that surrounds those who refuse to kneel before either. It started, like many things do, with a question you weren't supposed to ask. Something about whether the coins were meant to serve people, or the other way around. Maybe you said it too loudly in the wrong company. Maybe you tested your theory on one of the real coins. Whether your crime was physical or philosophical stopped mattering quickly. The charge came down without ceremony. You defaced the currency. Not just the coinage of trade, but the unspoken currency of belonging, of order, of acceptable thoughts, passed between citizens like salted bread. And for that, the city did what all proud cities do when faced with someone who peels back the veneer. It spat you out. There was no crowd waiting at the port, no theatrical exile carved into memory. Just an announcement from the magistrate, a few sharp glances from neighbors, and a man waiting beside a boat with a name you'd never heard. They didn't chain you or shout you down. They didn't have to. Exile does its own work, quietly removing the inconvenience and sweeping it toward the sea. You left without protest. They didn't deserve the sound of your voice. The boat stinks of brine and dried fish, its deck splintered and uneven beneath your feet. The captain watches you like a man expecting theft, but he says nothing as you settle in near the bow, folding your cloak beneath you like a makeshift cushion. You don't sleep. You watch the waves stretch into the dark and wonder if the horizon ever leads to anything better or just to more of the same. More people trying to look important, more cities pretending that their customs are the only ones that matter. Behind you, the coast of Sinope fades like a memory that never belonged to you in the first place. When the captain finally offers you wine on the second evening, you take the cup, swirl it once, and then pour it over the side without looking at him. He says nothing, but you can feel his disdain. It's fine. Let him stew. You're not here to be liked. You're here to burn off what's left of who you used to be. You arrive in Athens on a day so hot the marble seems to sweat. The city doesn't greet you. It doesn't need to. It simply looms, wide, ancient, and indifferent. You step off the boat barefoot, and the stone stings your soles, reminding you that you are far from home and far from welcome. You pass through the first gate with a sack that holds nothing but a crust of bread and a knife too dull to sell. A guard eyes you, says nothing, and waves you through. In his eyes, you're already invisible. The city is louder than you expected. Voices ricochet off columns and stone stairs, rising and falling with a rhythm that feels half sacred and half absurd. Philosophers argue beneath fig trees, while dogs scavenge for scraps between their sandaled feet. Everything seems too polished, too certain, too sure of itself. It doesn't take long to notice that most people speak in rehearsed phrases, like actors in a play they didn't write. You begin to wonder if the whole city is just a larger version of a coin, right on one side, blank on the other. You sleep your first night in the shadow of a closed market stall, your back pressed against warm stone, listening to the soft clatter of amphorae and the distant muttering of men too rich to whisper. Someone kicks you awake before dawn and calls you a stray. You sit up slowly, wipe the grit from your eyes, and tell them, a stray lives more honestly than a man who obeys out of fear. He doesn't reply. They never do, not when you speak plainly. Over the next few days, you make yourself a part of the city in the only way it allows, by refusing to fit. You don't beg, but you accept the offerings. You don't speak often, but when you do, people remember. You say things that make them laugh uncomfortably, the kind of laugh that comes from being caught holding something rotten in your hands and trying to pretend it's fruit. And then one day, while resting against the base of a worn column near the temple steps, you hear a voice that doesn't make your skin crawl. The man speaking is old, sharp-eyed, with a voice that cuts through the background noise like a blade across linen. He quotes no gods. He offers no flattery. He speaks of virtue like it's something that might actually belong in the street instead of the academy. His name is Antisthenes, and when you approach him, he does not scowl or turn away. He simply glances at you and says, "Another dog, come to sniff the bones of philosophy?" You grin and sit at his feet. That moment, quiet, unmarked, unnoticed by the city, feels more important than any trial or exile. You don't say it aloud, but you understand something new. You didn't lose a home. You escaped one. And now, here in the cracked heart of Athens, you found the beginning of something stranger. Not a philosophy, not a school, but a kind of life stripped of decoration, stripped of approval, stripped down to its bones. Athens doesn't know it yet, but its temples, its statues, its speeches, and its silver are about to feel the sting of your teeth. And while you still wear your father's old cloak, the man who once followed orders in Sinope is already gone. You rise with the sun the next morning, not to give thanks or prepare a speech, but to walk barefoot toward the agora. You don't know what you'll find there, only that it will be full of men pretending to understand the world, and that it's time someone taught them how to live without pretending at all. Athens reveals itself not with a grand welcome, but with layers, each one louder, sweatier, and more self-impressed than the last. You walk slowly, not because you're weak or unsure, but because you want to feel the full weight of it. Your bare feet slap against sun-warmed stone, leaving dusty prints behind, as if you're claiming the city one smudge at a time. The cloak draped around your shoulders has already begun to fray at the edges. It pulls oddly to one side, stretched thin from nights on rooftops and mornings curled beneath stalls. You wear it like a flag, a challenge, or maybe just a warning. I am not here to belong. No one stops you. They stare, though. You notice that early on, how the Athenians look at strangers with the casual arrogance of people who assume anything unfamiliar must be beneath them. A few sneer at the state of your clothes. One boy even points and laughs, though his mother grabs his wrist and mutters something sharp. That, you think, is Athens in a gesture, disdain layered with caution. These people revere decorum like it's a civic god, and already you're beginning to wonder how loudly you'll have to speak before they listen. The agora stretches wide before you. It's not quite what you'd imagined. Less polished, more chaotic. There's a rhythm to it, yes, but it's the rhythm of clashing voices and overlapping footsteps. Poets declaiming, bakers shouting prices, philosophers drawing lines in the dust to make points no one asked for. You pass a group huddled around a man who's explaining the nature of justice using a handful of pebbles. He looks proud of himself, like he's just solved the riddle of the universe, using river stones and a half-remembered parable. You squat a few feet from them, not close enough to be seen as part of the group, but not far enough to be ignored. Your cloak sags around your knees. You scratch at a spot on your arm and watch the lecture without blinking. When the philosopher announces that justice is each part fulfilling its natural role within the city, you bark, just once, loud, guttural, perfectly timed. The entire group jolts. The speaker freezes, his hand mid-gesture. You don't explain yourself. You just scratch again and look bored. The group disperses faster than you'd hoped. The speaker scowls. You grin. That's your first real Athenian argument, and it only took 3 hours and 1 bark. You move on, weaving through the market with the lazy confidence of someone who knows he doesn't belong and prefers it that way. A fruit vendor tries to sell you dates. You ask if they come with wisdom or just sugar. He tells you to piss off. You thank him. It's the most honest exchange you've had all day. In a corner near a half-collapsed column, you find a boy practicing his oratory. He's maybe 12, face flushed, voice cracking slightly as he recites a speech about civic virtue. You sit nearby, resting your chin on your hand. When he finishes, you clap, slow, deliberate, 3 beats too long. He bows slightly, uncertain whether he's being mocked or praised. You smile and ask him what civic virtue tastes like. He says nothing. You nod. That's the right answer. A group of older students passes you on their way to a lecture. One of them scoffs and mutters, "Sinope." You look up and raise your eyebrows. You know of it? You ask. He smirks. Only what the rumors say. A city too small to keep its madmen. You scratch your chin thoughtfully, and yet Athens seems happy to collect them. His friends laugh, but the smirk falters. You stand slowly, not threatening, just present. Be careful, you say. This city has a habit of honoring men only after it kills them. He doesn't respond. He doesn't need to. You've already won that conversation. You make your way toward the Stoa, the shaded walkway where respectable philosophers gather to test each other's minds without dirtying their hands. You lean against one of the columns and listen. There's talk of moderation, balance, eternal forms. All very clean, all very careful. You spit in the dirt and watch the disgust ripple through the group like cold water on hot oil. No one speaks to you. No one asks your thoughts. Not yet. They don't know what to do with you. That suits you just fine. Later, you follow the smell of oil and sweat to the gymnasium. Men wrestle, argue, pose. You watch a debate about self-control unravel into shouting and laughter, then a shared jug of wine. One man notices you and shouts, "And what do you believe in, stranger?" You think for a moment, then answer, "In living as if no one's watching, and laughing when they are." They laugh. One throws you a crust of bread. You bow deeply, then eat it without thanks. Let them figure out if that was a lesson. The city pulses around you, unfolding, narrowing, revealing cracks between its ideals and its appetites. You begin to learn the spots where philosophy becomes performance, the places where the cloaks are thickest and the virtues most paper-thin. You linger at the edges of these conversations, not to participate, but to test their boundaries. Athens speaks often of virtue, but rarely of dirt. You plan to remind it of both. You end the day beneath a portico. It smells faintly of mold and old figs. A dog noses your side, then lies down beside you. You share the last bite of your bread, then scratch behind its ears. Someone nearby is still reciting verses. Something about harmony and justice. You close your eyes and wonder how long it will take before they understand that truth can bark, squat, and stink just like any living thing. Tomorrow, you decide you'll begin testing the real pillars of the city. Not the marble ones, but the walking, breathing, self-important ones in robes and sandals. They're the ones who believe they understand man's nature. You're here to prove otherwise. Long before you see him, the name drifts through Athens like incense, light, heady, and too sweet to trust. Plato. The mind behind the forms, the architect of abstract truth, the man who speaks of invisible ideals with the certainty of someone who has never had to eat from the street. His students gather around him like bees around a fig tree, drawn to the shape of knowledge, even if they don't quite taste its substance. You watch them pass in clusters, robes clean, scrolls tucked under arms, their words floating a few feet above the ground, where your bare feet carry you. You've already heard the stories. The cave, the shadow play, the philosopher who climbs from darkness into blinding clarity and then tries, always tries, to return and teach the others. It's a compelling image, at least until you ask who built the cave and why no one in it seems allowed to kick over the fire and leave. You suspect that behind Plato's polished allegories, there's a fear of dirt. Not literal dirt, but the kind that clings to life when you stop pretending it's something else. You make your way to the academy on a morning thick with dust and cicada song. The marble portico casts long shadows, and the students inside sit in symmetrical rows, heads tilted in identical postures of reverence. Plato stands at the front, not raised high like a tyrant, but still elevated, his ideas even more so. You settle near the edge, not quite seated, not quite standing, your presence registering slowly like a stain creeping into fine fabric. A few of the students glance your way, but say nothing. Perhaps they assume you're a servant. Perhaps they just hope you'll go away. The lecture begins. He speaks of the soul, of its hunger for the good, of the blindness of the senses. You listen closely, more than they do. You watch not just his words, but his hands, his tone, the way he allows no interruptions. The cave returns, of course. He describes the prisoners chained in ignorance, the ascent toward enlightenment, and the forms, eternal, pure, unchanging. The students nod on cue. You clear your throat, raise a hand, and wait. He ignores you. You lower your hand and remain silent for a while, until he arrives at the part where the philosopher returns to the cave to rescue others. That's when you shift your weight forward and bark, just once. Not a loud bark, not theatrical, just enough to turn heads. Every eye is on you now. Even Plato pauses, adjusting the folds of his robe as if the silence belongs to him and must be arranged just so. You speak. I have a question, you say, your voice steady, not raised. If the prisoner learns the truth, but still prefers the fire, is he still blind? A murmur passes through the room. Plato regards you for a moment and answers with the tone of a man lecturing a misbehaving pupil. He is not truly free. Ignorance, once exposed, cannot be comfortably resumed. You nod slowly, so there is no dignity and comfort, only an assent. He inclines his head as if indulging a stubborn child. Dignity lies in the soul's alignment with truth. You scratch your shoulder through your cloak. Then let me offer you another truth. I once saw a beggar reject a coin because it came from a man who spat on him. He chose hunger over insult. Was that soul misaligned? The students begin to fidget. One of them, a younger boy with a soft face and ink-stained fingers, looks genuinely unsure. Plato doesn't answer immediately. When he does, it is with care, not kindness. Truth is not defined by pride or rejection. It is defined by the essence of what is real. You nod again. And what is more real? An idea of a chair, or the splinter in your thigh when you sit on a broken one? Laughter rises from the edges of the group. Plato's face tightens. He does not respond this time. You're dismissed not by words, but by a glance toward the servant standing near the entrance. You leave without resistance. You've done what you came to do, not to win, but to rattle. The boy with the ink-stained fingers watches you go. That's enough. That afternoon, you return to the Agra with a featherless chicken tucked under your arm. You've plucked it yourself, clumsily, leaving stubble and scratches where the feathers used to be. You wait for the right moment. And when it comes, when Plato declares in a separate gathering that man is a featherless biped, you step forward, raise the chicken high, and declare, "Behold your man." The silence is exquisite. For a moment, you see it all at once, the confusion, the shock, the flicker of amusement in one or two faces before decorum smothers it. Plato turns away, not with rage, but with practiced weariness. He will not argue with someone who refuses to accept the rules of the game. That suits you perfectly. You never agreed to the game. From that day on, your name circles the city. Some call you dangerous, others a clown, a madman, a necessary nuisance. You pay them little attention. Your goal is not to persuade, but to expose, to remind people that their beautiful ideas wither under pressure, that their truths are fragile things, easily shattered by a featherless chicken or a poorly timed question. And yet, for all your satisfaction in disrupting their harmony, there's a moment later that stays with you. You sit near the fountain at dusk, watching a boy drink from cupped hands, his movements simple and fluid. No vessel, no ceremony, just water and need. You had once owned a cup, carved from olive wood, smoothed by time and habit. But after seeing that boy, you walked to the market square and shattered it on the stone. The less you carry, the more you see. And in that moment, you understand that philosophy is not something to hold. It's something to lose, bit by bit, until nothing remains but hunger, dirt, and the strange peace of asking questions that no longer need answers. You keep the memory of the boy with the cupped hands, the way some men keep charms around their necks. Quietly, reverently, a reminder that truth sometimes arrives barefoot and uninvited. His gesture hadn't been meant for you, of course. He was just thirsty, maybe 10 years old, walking home from market, pausing at the public fountain under the shadow of the olive trees. No audience, no performance. He simply leaned down, dipped his palms beneath the stream, and drank. That was it. No scroll could have taught you more. You had stood there longer than anyone else, watching as the boy's fingers held the water gently and let it spill between them like it wasn't meant to be hoarded. He didn't speak, didn't look around for approval. He quenched his thirst, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and moved on. And in that small moment, you felt your old habits wrinkle and peel away. Because up until then, you thought your wooden cup was a symbol of your freedom. Simple, practical, unadorned. But suddenly, it looked like decoration. A prop, another layer between yourself and the world. That night, you sat cross-legged in the marketplace, the cup in one hand and a stone in the other. The cup was light, familiar, worn smooth by years of use. You had kept it through exile, through months of hunger, through rainy nights when its hollow helped you measure how much water the sky had dropped. It had always been enough. But now it was too much. You studied its curve, its comfort, and then, without ceremony, brought the stone down hard and split the wood in two. The pieces scattered across the dirt. A nearby woman gasped. Someone asked if you'd gone mad. You answered without looking up. A child has just taught me I have more than I need. In the days that followed, your reputation shifted. You were no longer just the filthy man in the cloak, or the one who barked at priests and philosophers. You became something else, an echo of that broken cup, an irritation that scraped at Athens' polished sense at itself. People started watching you more closely, hoping to catch whatever strange lesson you might perform next. You rarely disappointed them. When asked about it later, you said the same thing every time. He drank with his hands. I had to unlearn my cup. Most laughed. Some nodded. A few, to your quiet satisfaction, walked away in silence, looking down at the items they carried, suddenly unsure whether they owned those things or were owned by them. You moved deeper into the city, not physically, but symbolically. You took to resting in the shadow of a barrel left unused near the potter's quarter. Not a true barrel, of course. It was a large pithos, a clay storage vessel meant for grain or wine, now cracked and abandoned, lying on its side like a toppled monument. You slid into it one afternoon during a storm, simply to avoid the rain. But the moment your back pressed against the cool clay, something in you settled. It was dry, it was hollow, it was enough. You stayed. The Athenians didn't know what to make of that. Some found it hilarious. Diogenes lives in a jar, they whispered, giggling as they passed. Others found it offensive. A man like that should be removed, said a priest who never once spoke to you directly. But there you remained, curled up like a strange oracle, half inside, half out, resting among the discarded things of the city. You liked the way it felt, cut off, but still visible, vulnerable, but not exposed. It was the perfect contradiction. Each morning, you emerged like a hermit crab from its borrowed shell, blinking into the Athenian sun, stretching limbs stiff from the curve of the clay. Your first steps of the day were never rushed. You let the dirt greet you properly. You passed the fruit stalls, the bread sellers, the soft murmurs of scholars on the edge of the square. You heard their words, but rarely listened. There was something more urgent in the scratch of your knee, the rumble in your belly, the way your dog looked at you when his ribs began to show. Ideas were fine, but they didn't fill your stomach, and they certainly didn't last through the rain. One morning, a young man stopped at the edge of your pithos, holding a scroll and trying not to wrinkle his nose. Aren't you ashamed, he asked, to live like this when men of learning reside in comfort? You looked at him for a long moment, then gestured to the jar. I am, you said, ashamed to live in a world where comfort is confused with meaning. That evening, you returned to the fountain and sat near it in silence, not to drink, but to watch. You hoped, perhaps foolishly, to see the boy again, the one who drank without hesitation, without pretense. He never came. Or if he did, he had grown taller, heavier, weighed down by his own opinions. You missed him anyway. He had taught you more in one moment than half the city did in a lifetime of lectures. As twilight settled over Athens, your jar glowed faintly in the fading light, casting a long curve-shaped shadow across the stones. A dog padded over and curled beside you. You patted its head and leaned back inside your new home. You hadn't meant to stay there permanently. Not at first, but now it felt right. No roof, no doors, no locks. Just air, earth, and space enough for one man to sleep and maybe wake with fewer illusions than the day before. And as you lay there, half wrapped in your cloak, bones pressed to cool clay, you thought of all the fine houses you had passed that day. The painted walls, the bronze handles, the olive oil lamps burning behind thick curtains. And none of them, not one, had felt as free as this broken jar and the dirt beneath your feet. Tomorrow, the city would see you again, at the market, near the philosopher's corner, always watching, always interfering. But tonight, you lie still in the jar, listening to the dogs breathe and the wind rustle through fig trees, and you remember how easily a child can lift water to his lips without needing anything more than his own hands. The sun hangs high above the agora when the sound begins to change. You notice it before the crowd does. It's not the usual bustle of sandals, scraping stone, or merchants shouting over food carts. This sound arrives with polish, with rhythm, with the measured footfalls of men who are trained to walk without hesitation. You don't lift your head immediately. Instead, you stay where you are, nestled beside your pithos, the curve of the jar supporting your back as you run your fingers through the dust. One dog is curled under your knee, twitching in sleep. Another gnaws idly at something that used to be bread. You're not surprised by the approaching noise. You expected it eventually. They say power moves quietly, but it doesn't. Not in a city like Athens. When power enters, people shift their weight and pretend not to watch. Conversations taper off. Even the fishmongers lower their voices. You finally look up, blinking through the light, and see the first glint of bronze. A soldier's chest plate, catching the sun just enough to seem brighter than any flesh should. The guards step into the square in formation, spears upright, faces blank. Behind them walks the one who commands them all. He is younger than you expected. His face is smooth and strangely clean, the kind of clean that speaks of scented oils and careful grooming rather than genuine purity. His sandals are strapped too tight, as if he's afraid of losing his footing in a place that isn't his. And yet, he walks like a man who believes that every space belongs to him the moment he enters it. He surveys the market as if it's an idea to be rearranged. The people part for him as if trained, though none of them has ever seen him before. They just know. Alexander, you've heard the stories just as everyone else has. Born to kings, tutored by Aristotle. Already a conqueror by the time he could grow a proper beard. He is the kind of man people expect statues to be made of while he's still alive. You watch him step forward, past the guards, with only a handful of attendants behind him. They hang back without being told. He doesn't need protection. Not here. Not yet. He approaches slowly, pausing a few paces away. His gaze drifts over the pithos, over your tangled hair, your bare feet, the dogs at your side. He doesn't speak right away. That's how you know he's clever. A fool would have started talking the moment he saw you. Instead, he studies you, not with disdain, but with a curiosity that you recognize as dangerous. This is a man who wants to understand the world so he can remake it. You're Diogenes, he says, and you nod once, not shifting from your seat. I've heard of you. His voice is even, smooth, practiced in the way of someone who speaks often and expects to be listened to. You say nothing at first. You lift a hand instead and gesture to your face, then toward the sun, now blocked by his shadow. Would you mind, you ask? You're standing in my light. There is a pause, a longer one than you anticipated. The nearby crowd freezes. No one moves. Somewhere behind Alexander, one of his men shifts nervously, unsure whether this moment is about to become history or punishment. But Alexander doesn't blink. His mouth tightens slightly, then curves upward into something that might be a smile. He steps aside. The sunlight returns to your chest, warm, uninterrupted. You lean back against the jar again and exhale, more out of habit than relief. Alexander remains where he is, studying you still. You live like this by choice? He asks, though it isn't really a question. You sleep in a jar. You own nothing. You ask nothing. You glance up at him, more curious than annoyed. I had a cup once, you say, but a child taught me. I didn't need it. That draws a sharper look from him, though not one of mockery. He folds his arms, considering. I've conquered lands farther than the wind reaches, he says after a moment. Cities bend to me before I speak. I could give you anything. Gold, a house, your own school, if you wanted. You shake your head slowly. And would I need to thank you every time the roof didn't fall in? Would I owe a salute for every mouthful of olives I could once find for myself? He doesn't answer that. Not because he lacks one, but because he's smart enough, to know the answer won't satisfy either of you. Instead, he nods once. If I were not Alexander, he says, I would wish to be Diogenes. You stretch your legs out further, your heel brushing against the sleeping dog's ribs. And if I were not Diogenes, you reply, I'd still be Diogenes. The silence that follows is not uncomfortable. It settles like dust on a quiet day. Alexander turns his head, perhaps realizing that there is nothing here for him to conquer. He has tried generosity, and it has been declined. He has offered admiration, and it has been returned without flattery. There is no transaction to complete. That makes this encounter, for him, oddly rare. He leaves without fanfare, mounts his horse without speaking. The guards fall in behind him like parts of a machine returning to function. The market resumes its hum slowly, cautiously, as if not quite believing the moment has passed. You lean back into the curve of your jar, feeling the last of the heat settle against your skin. The dogs stir, sensing the tension dissolve. One licks your foot before flopping back down into the dust. The story spreads by evening. That's always how it happens. You didn't plan to become a parable, but Athens prefers its truths in story form. The man who denied the king. The philosopher who asked nothing and lost nothing. You expect to hear your own words misquoted by tomorrow. You don't mind. You've said them once, clearly, with the sun on your chest. That's enough. What interests you isn't the attention. It's the look Alexander gave you before he left. The flicker of something like confusion beneath the pride. You know that look. It's the moment a man realizes that not all power can be understood by force or gold or conquest. That some things resist being claimed. You watch the sky darken above the Acropolis and think of what comes next. Not for him, for you. You've held your ground. Now it's time to remind the city that even its smallest dogs can bite when provoked. Your time doesn't end with a grand moment, or with crowds gathered to weep over your wisdom. There's no procession, no academy carved in your name, no deathbed recitation of final thoughts for students to write down and misinterpret for centuries. You wouldn't have allowed it anyway. You always said the most honest thing a man could do was die the way he lived, unadorned, inconvenient, and preferably outdoors. They will argue for years about how it happened. Some will say you held your breath and died by sheer force of will, as if even your death had to be an act of rebellion. Others claim you ate a raw octopus and it poisoned you. And there's one version, your favorite, that says you was bitten by a dog and refused treatment because, in your words, it's poetic. You leave them with so many possibilities, and not one of them makes you seem noble. You would have liked that. The truth is simpler, and not particularly dramatic. You wake one morning beneath your jar, feeling a stillness that isn't peace. Your joints don't ache the same way. The light doesn't bother your eyes. The dogs are already awake, unusually quiet, watching you with that animal intuition that doesn't wait for language. You scratch behind one of their ears and lean against the pithos for a long while, listening to the sound of the market beginning to stretch its limbs. The baker yells about loaves that aren't quite warm. A man drops a basket of olives and curses the gods. A scholar recites something no one asked to hear. You know you've said what needed saying. Not in the form of scrolls or doctrines, but in the eyes of the children who still point and whisper. In the awkward silences you leave behind at symposiums. In the way even the priests seem to look over their shoulders now, before offering blessings in the street. You've become a presence larger than your body, a disruption that walks beside people even when you're nowhere nearby. That morning, you walk the city slowly. You let the dust settle deeper into your feet. You lean against pillars just to feel the grain of them against your back. You call out to no one in particular, asking again if anyone has seen an honest man. A few people laugh. A few others glance down, shuffling quickly past. You stop to share a fig with a beggar who doesn't recognize you, and you don't correct him when he assumes you're just another hungry man in a cloak. That's close enough to the truth. By midday, you return to the place where the barrel sits. It's quieter now. Fewer students trying to impress their tutors. Fewer merchants shouting above each other. You crawl into the jar and stretch out your limbs. The clay is warm from the sun, rough in places where it's begun to crack. You press your hand against the inside wall and feel the familiar curve beneath your palm. The dogs follow you, curling up beside the entrance, half in the shade, half in the light. You speak to them for a while. Not with words, not really. You've always liked their company better than most philosophers. They don't flatter. They don't argue. They don't pretend to understand. They just listen, or ignore you entirely, depending on their mood. You've always admired that. One of them, the older one with the ragged ear, rests his chin on your leg, and you let him. The breath leaves you more easily than you expected. There's no pain, no struggle. Just a gradual unspooling, as if your body finally decided there was nothing left to bark at. Your eyes close. Your fingers stop twitching, and the dogs stay still, alert but not alarmed. They find you there some hours later. A fishmonger, perhaps, or a curious boy chasing pigeons. The news spreads quickly, though no one is sure what to do about it. You had no family, no school of followers, no heirs to gather around and interpret your silence. Just a body in a jar, and a few dogs who don't seem to be in a hurry to leave. Some say the city buried you outside the walls, near the place where the strays still gather. Others claim someone had the sense to cremate you, though no one agrees on who. A stone was placed somewhere, eventually, but it's small, worn, and doesn't carry your name. Just the carving of a dog, lying beside a man with no sandals. That feels appropriate. The stories begin immediately. You become not just a man, but a figure, a provocation, a point of reference for arguments that will last longer than the memory of the man himself. Some say you were a hero. Some say you were a madman. Most are content to call you a philosopher and leave the contradictions alone. But beneath all of that, something lingers. A scent of garlic and dust. The echo of a bark in the marketplace. A pair of muddy footprints that seem to reappear near the temples, even long after the jar is gone. People say they see you sometimes, in dreams, in moments of doubt, in arguments where a quiet voice asks, "Why do you need that?" And in that question, there you are. You do not need a monument. The city already has too many. What you left behind wasn't structure, it was interruption. And interruption never dies. It returns in stranger forms, in younger voices, in smaller acts that unsettle the comfortable and remind the dressed, and perfume that they are still animals underneath. As for the dogs, they linger by the jar for days. Then one by one, they disappear into the city, into the alleys and back roads, curling beneath new carts, sniffing new hands, waiting for someone else to speak to them without expecting a title or a reward. And just like that, Athens moves on. But before we follow it, before we leave your jar and the dirt, and your strange, tooth-bearing grin behind, we turn to the questions that still ripple through the streets you walked. Not just about your life, but about your ideas. The ones that refuse to wear robes, or take baths, or sign their names. We trace the stories you left scattered like half-gnawed bones. Tales of jars, jokes about philosophers, stunts that may or may not have happened. Because the mystery isn't whether you were mad. The mystery is why you lived that way, and why, centuries later, the world still can't decide if you were the wisest man in it. You crouch once again at the lip of the Pythos, your knees bent, your shoulders hunched inside the curved wall of clay. The same question has been asked by half the city already. They mutter it as they pass, whisper it like gossip, or shout it in debate halls, where names are stretched and scrub it into parables. Did Diogenes really live in a jar? It's repeated like a riddle, not because it's difficult, but because no one wants to believe the answer is that simple. And yet here you are, leaning back against ceramic meant for grain or wine, and calling it home. The word they use is pithos, not a small vessel, not a decorative urn, but a wide-bellied storage jar as tall as a man and twice as heavy. It wasn't designed for living, but then again, neither was the city. The stone homes with their courtyards and carved lintels never made much room for honesty. The pithos, on the other hand, doesn't lie. It's empty, unforgiving, unfurnished, and that's why it suits you. The people who ask about it never touch it. They gather at a polite distance, pointing, arguing over whether the stories are literal or symbolic, their robes always just clean enough to avoid contact. You've seen them try to explain the jar as metaphor. A statement on civic disengagement, one said, as if you were trying to compose a lecture through posture alone. Another said it must be a legend, that no man would choose to live without a roof, unless he had lost his mind or sought divine attention. You watched that one speak for a long time without interrupting. When he finished, you pulled your cloak aside, scratched your chest, and asked if he had ever tried sitting in one. He turned red. That was enough. In truth, the jar is not comfortable. It doesn't protect against heat or cold. It leaks when it rains. In summer, it bakes your skin. In winter, it keeps the chill like a grudge. But it is yours, not because you own it, but because no one else wants it. That's the only kind of possession you trust. No one envies a man who sleeps with the dogs and calls Clay home. And so, no one tries to take it from you. You chose it not as a symbol, but as a subtraction. A house invites maintenance. A door invites expectation. A roof invites security. You needed none of those. You had a place to stretch your legs and lean your spine, and you were not beholden to any man's rules when you sat inside it. There were no debts in the jar, no decoration, no ceremony. Just the slow turning of sunlight across the clay and the hum of the city beyond. Even the dogs learned to respect it. They didn't sleep inside, not unless the wind was bad and the night was colder than usual. They preferred the edges, curling near the rim like shadows with paws. You often thought they understood the pithos better than the philosophers did. A man would question it. A dog would simply walk in, sniff once, and lie down. The mystery persists because people want it to. It is easier to imagine you as a metaphor than a man. They want the jar to stand for something larger, asceticism, defiance, mockery, even performance. But if you were to stand in front of them, hands resting on the rim, you would say plainly, "It is a jar. I sleep in it. That is all." And still, they would argue. Some believe you never stayed in one place long enough to call anything home. Others claim the jar was only for effect, that you wandered the hills at night or slept on temple steps when the crowds grew too curious. You made no effort to clarify. You never wrote it down. You never gave a speech or sketched a floor plan. You let the ambiguity do the talking. Because truth, especially the kind that makes people uncomfortable, does its best work when it's misunderstood. Years later, people will write about the jar as if it were a temple. They'll argue over its location, its size, whether it faced east or west. Some will say it never existed, that it was a literary device, an exaggeration, the invention of students eager to simplify your life into a single, clay-walled symbol. And perhaps, in their world of scrolls and arguments, that makes sense. But you remember the curve of the rim against your back. You remember the way your feet hung just slightly out into the dust. You remember the way the dogs breathed against your ankles, and the silence that came when night fell, and the city stopped pretending it was more than it was. The truth is that the jar wasn't a message. It wasn't an emblem. It was a solution. The streets of Athens were too loud, the houses too full of performance, the philosophers too busy admiring their own logic to notice when their sandals squeaked. The jar gave you a place to be outside all of it, Not above, not below, just outside. When a boy once asked you why you lived in such a thing, you answered with your usual indifference, because the palace was taken. He laughed, not because it was clever, but because he didn't understand. You didn't explain. He would learn, eventually, if he was lucky enough to be ignored by the right people. So did you live in a jar? Yes, no, often, rarely, depending on the season, the day, and whether the conversation was worth escaping. The jar was never the point. The jar was just the place they remembered, the shape they attached to your refusal. And long after your feet leave the dust, the question will remain, echoing through lecture halls and quiet libraries, in languages not yet spoken, by men not yet born. It will be asked again and again, never quite answered. And the more they ask, the more they will reveal how little they understand what it means to own nothing and still be full. But for now, the jar sits as it always has, half shelter, half riddle, empty, except for the fading warmth of the man who once chose to sleep inside it rather than kneel outside someone else's door. You've been called a dog so many times that it no longer strikes as insult. In fact, you adopted the name before your critics had the chance to weaponize it. Cynicos, they said, cynic, as if to reduce your entire way of life into a bark. But you took that bark and made it a method. You let it echo through porticos and over rooftops. If philosophers clung to words, you clung to teeth. If they were going to call you a dog, then you would show them what a dog really is. You did not choose the metaphor lightly. A dog, after all, lives without shame. It eats when hungry, sleeps when tired, growls when threatened, and licks when it wants affection. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't dress itself in robes and call the result wisdom. It doesn't build temples to its own ideas or stand beneath marble statues reciting lessons on virtue. It lives, and by living honestly, it becomes the very thing most men fear, an animal without delusion. You began to lean into the role. You barked at the rich. You bared your teeth at sophists and politicians. You lifted your leg near columns dedicated to gods who never answered prayers. Some thought you were merely provoking. Others thought you were mad. But you weren't barking to amuse or offend. You were doing it because it told the truth louder than argument ever could. There's a clarity in a growl, a purity in the way a dog shows its intent. One morning, you squatted beside the steps of the temple while a group of men argued about what it meant to live with virtue. Their sandals were clean. Their hands moved like dancers. They quoted laws, measured desires, named every passion like a gardener listing weeds. You yawned, stretched, and began licking your foot. When one of them shouted in outrage, you looked up and replied, "A dog knows when he is dirty." Can you say the same? The laughter that followed didn't last long. It turned into silence, the kind that smells like discomfort left too long in the sun. You noticed something else in those silences, something the philosophers would never admit. They envied the dog. They hid it well behind their polished sentences and ceremonial beards. But it was there, in the way their eyes followed your movements, half disgusted, half fascinated. They had built entire careers on escaping nature, and you came along to remind them that nature can't be escaped. It only changes its clothing. You were not trying to tear down their schools. You were trying to show them that they were still animals, no matter how many definitions they clung to. The dog became more than a metaphor. It became a tool. You followed strays through alleys, watched how they sniffed before trusting, how they fought without politics, how they never lied. You mimicked their posture. You learned when to growl and when to sit quietly beside someone until they admitted something real. You began to think the city could be improved if every man spent a day as a dog and every dog were allowed to teach. But the city wasn't ready for that. It never would be. Still, the image stuck. You walked the streets like a four-legged rebuke. Mothers pulled their children away when you approached. Men averted their eyes, unsure whether to laugh, argue, or throw something. Even the guards hesitated now. They didn't fear your body. They feared what it said, that all their titles and laws and property were no better than sticks and bones buried in the dirt. You made them feel like impostors in their own skins. And yet, for all your defiance, you never saw the dog as low. You saw it as honest. You believed that shame was a disease passed from man to man like bad wine, and that dogs, being immune to it, lived closer to the truth. A dog doesn't ask whether he belongs in the marketplace. He simply exists there, as fully as possible. You wanted that kind of existence. You wanted a life without explanation. One afternoon, a student asked you what philosophy meant. You told him it was learning to live like a dog in a world full of men who think they're gods. He asked if that meant giving up speech, logic, and discipline. You told him no, those were tools. But tools mean nothing if the hand that holds them is afraid to touch dirt. He didn't return the next day. You didn't expect him to. Even as your hair grayed and your joints stiffened, the dogs never left your side. They never judged the day you howled at a priest in the middle of a funeral procession, or the time you ate a whole onion in front of an ambassador just to make a point about indulgence. They accepted you the way they accept everything, without expectation, without pretense. That, to you, was philosophy in its rawest form. They taught you that presence is more powerful than position. Eventually, the nickname stuck harder than your real one. Fewer people called you Diogenes. They called you the dog, the cynic, the creature in the jar. You didn't mind. You had built your life on the rejection of titles, and if they wanted to assign you one that meant animal, then let it be. You would bark when truth required it, growl when the city pretended too much, and curl up beside those who smelled of hunger and quiet desperation. You would not flatter. You would not lie. The dog does not pretend to be more than it is. That's why it frightened them. Not because it was savage, but because it was free. And though the city never quite accepted you, and the scholars never quite forgave you, they could never forget the sound of your voice when you barked at the edges of their logic. You lived like a dog, but you left behind something more stubborn than marble. You left behind the echo. And now, as we follow that echo into the strangest stories of your life, we must ask not only what you did, but why you did it in full view of a city that constantly tried to look away. It doesn't take long for you to realize that nothing frightens a well-mannered man more than someone who refuses to play by the rules. Not laws, exactly. Those can be challenged, argued, rewritten. No, what truly unsettles them is when someone ignores the unspoken agreements, the expectations written between gestures, the rhythms of nods and courtesies, the elaborate dance of pretense that glues polite society together. So you begin to target that structure directly, not with violence or slogans, but with something far more dangerous, shamelessness. You don't just break manners. You study them, identify their pressure points, and twist them until the people around you forget what they were pretending to be. You know exactly what to say, what to do, and more importantly, when to do it. You wait until the words become their most brittle, during a eulogy, a lecture, a prayer, and then you speak. Not because you crave disruption, but because you want to see if the ideas they cling to are still standing when their discomfort rises. One day you walk into a crowded bathhouse and begin washing your vegetables in the fountain, while two men argue about the nature of moderation. They falter mid-sentence as you scrub onions between your knuckles and flick water on the stone. You hum a tune you haven't named. When one of them finally asks, voice trembling with restrained offense, "Do you mind?" You glance up and reply, "Only when the water's dirty." The other begins to laugh, but he chokes it down. That's the part you notice. The impulse to laugh is always there. It's the manners that smother it. You're not interested in cruelty. You're not here to hurt. Your aim is simpler, and perhaps more unsettling. You want to see who's real. You want to watch a man's face when his rehearsed lines fall apart, when he's forced to respond without the armor of custom. That's when the truth leaks out, not through philosophy, but through discomfort. You experiment constantly. At one of Plato's gatherings, you enter uninvited, carrying a piece of salted fish in each hand, and sit in the center of the conversation without introducing yourself. You begin eating slowly, bones and all. At first, no one speaks. Then, after several minutes of awkward shuffling and forced coughing, one student dares to ask what you're doing. Demonstrating appetite, you say through a mouthful of skin, and watching yours disappear. In the markets, you lie on the ground and roll across the pavement, groaning in mock ecstasy as you sun yourself like a drunkard. Bystanders hiss and mutter, calling you vulgar, obscene, unspeakable. But the children laugh. Always the children. Their parents pull them away, red-faced and scolding. But the sound of the laughter lingers longer than the scolding ever does. You never shout at the children. You nod. Sometimes, if one is bold enough to mimic you, you give him a fig. You begin performing these acts with the precision of a sculptor. A sneeze at a silent meal. A fart during a public reading. A dramatic yawn during the opening lines of a hymn. Each time, the reaction teaches you something. How quickly civility turns brittle. How deep shame runs. How easily disgust replaces understanding. The men who claim to study the soul cannot stand the smell of your body. The women who pray for virtue cannot bear the sight of you squatting beneath the temple steps. You wonder what, exactly, they're worshiping. At night, as you settle against the rim of your pithos, the city still humming in your ears, you think about performance, not as deceit, but as a weapon. They've built a theater out of daily life, every gesture loaded with implication, every sentence sanded down to prevent offense. So you walk into the theater and speak your lines out of order. You ignore the cues. You refuse to wear the costume, and you watch the stage fall apart. There's a dinner you remember vividly. You weren't invited. You rarely are. But you arrived anyway, barefoot and wrapped in a cloak that had not seen oil in weeks. The men reclining on cushions tried to ignore you. They sipped sweet wine from goblets etched with lions, spoke in measured tones about the importance of harmony. You listened, nodding, until one of them addressed you directly. What is your view on harmony, Diogenes? You stood, lifted your cloak, and urinated into a bronze bowl. The room erupted. Half of them shouted. One fainted. Someone reached for a staff. You didn't flinch. You simply looked at the man who had asked and said, "That was the most honest sound I've heard all evening." You're not always so blunt. Sometimes you speak in parables, half mumbled. Sometimes you answer a question with another question. Sometimes you sit in complete silence until someone speaks just to fill the air. But the result is always the same. The structure buckles. The pose slips. The conversation that follows, if it survives at all, feels rawer, sharper, more real. That is your aim, not to destroy discourse, but to scrape away the marble from around it. The philosophers begin calling you a menace. The polite ones say you're confused. The bolder ones say you're diseased. One man suggests that your behavior might be caused by bad bile. You reply, and yours by bad thinking. His face stays red for the rest of the week, but not everyone looks away. A few young men begin following you. Not disciples, not students, just observers. They want to understand how someone can live so far outside the rules and still speak with clarity. You allow them to walk beside you, but you offer no instruction. Your actions are your words. If they don't understand the lessons in a yawn, they won't understand them in a scroll either. The city changes around you slowly. It doesn't become better, just more aware. You see it in the way people hesitate before offering pious answers. You hear it in the half-second pause before a man boasts of his discipline. You know that, somewhere in their thoughts, you linger, barefoot, unbent, unbothered by the customs they can't stop defending. And so, your campaign continues, not through speeches or manifestos, but through acts that gnaw at the edge of normalcy. One disruption at a time, you stage the collapse of matters, not for the sake of chaos, but for the hope, however faint, that someone somewhere might stop asking how to behave and start asking how to be. And yet, beneath these performances, something deeper continues to grow. Because while the city sees only your gestures, your noises, your dirt-caked feet, what lies beneath is a philosophy that predates all of it. A quiet inheritance passed from another man, equally strange, equally stubborn. It began not in the jar, but at the feet of a teacher who refused to compromise and who shaped the dog long before it learned to bark. You didn't invent this way of living, even if you became its loudest echo. Long before your feet touched the dust of Athens, long before you curled up inside the Pythos, it was another man, quiet, deliberate, deeply strange in his own way. His name was Antisthenes, and though he wore a threadbare cloak like yours, he rarely shouted. He wasn't the type to bark in the streets or scandalize the rich with onions and well-timed flatulence. No, Antisthenes didn't need theatrics. He was content to cut through the rot with silence and razor logic. Where others quoted Homer to impress their peers, he used Homer to tear illusions apart. You first saw him speaking near the Cynosarges Gymnasium, a place named for its association with dogs, a coincidence that felt like a prophecy later. He stood outside the main grounds, among the illegitimate, the poor, the overlooked, and he taught there on purpose. Not in the marble halls where young men practiced rhetoric while admiring their reflections, but in the sun, surrounded by noise, dust, and unwanted questions. It wasn't that he preferred the discomfort, it's that he knew truth didn't blossom in luxury. You watched him argue with Socratic calm, eyes half-lidded, voice even while students sneered at his simplicity. He didn't care. His cloak was patched, his sandals were worn, and his philosophy was sharp enough to draw blood. He believed that virtue was action, not theory, that a good life didn't require lectures or wealth, or even acceptance, just honesty. He told anyone who asked that happiness came from needing nothing, not acquiring everything. That message stuck to you harder than dust in your beard. You never called yourself his student aloud. That would have felt like flattery, and flattery was poison. But you watched him carefully, mimicked how he sat, how he listened without blinking, how he answered questions with questions that snapped back like a jaw trap. When he died, the streets didn't mourn. There was no grand funeral, just a ripple in the air around the Cynosarges, and then silence. Most people forgot him. You didn't, but even Antisthenes hadn't quite lit the fire. He carried the flint, showed you where the spark could land, but it was you who turned it into a flame. You who dragged philosophy out of the schools and into the gutters. You who decided that if truth couldn't survive ridicule, it wasn't worth having. You stood on his shoulders, sure, but then you howled. Before you came along, no one had a word for this approach. There were Stoics, still in their infancy, Platonists with their forms and careful diagrams, Pythagoreans counting everything to death. But what you did, they called it madness. Or worse, spectacle. But the truth was simpler. It was cynicism, though it didn't wear that name until later, long after you stopped breathing. Back then, they just called it Diogenes. And yet, it wasn't just yours. You saw pieces of it in other places. In Heracles, the mythic figure Antisthenes admired, the man who conquered beasts not through words, but through strength, solitude, and endurance. A life of labor over luxury, struggle over softness. That image stuck with you too. You carried Heracles in your stories, like a cloak thrown over your shoulder. Not because he was a god, but because he suffered without complaint and expected no reward. You borrowed nothing else from the gods. You saw how the temples crawled with lies, how gold clung to altars like rot, how prayers came with fees and oracles spoke in riddles designed to please their paymasters. If the gods wanted followers, they'd have to earn them. You preferred dogs. Still, the philosophy formed not as a system, but as a set of instincts. Want less, speak truth, strip away the false, ignore applause, laugh at power, live in accordance with nature, not society. These weren't commandments carved in stone. They were habits, patterns, a kind of mental muscle you flexed until people either flinched or followed. It was never about being correct. It was about being unafraid. Others tried to define you. The academics wanted categories. They asked for doctrines. They begged for scrolls, lists, proofs, diagrams. You gave them gestures instead. A bitten apple, a discarded bowl, a urination beside a statue. You didn't write anything down. You didn't found a school. You taught through discomfort, through contradiction, through relentless visibility. And though they mocked you for it, deep down they knew you were doing something their books never could. You were making people feel philosophy, not just read it. Cynicism, when the word finally came, wasn't a movement. It was a condition, like fever, or wind, or a necessary itch. You didn't want it to be systematized. You hated systems. But still, it found shape in your wake. Crates came next, selling everything he owned to follow you. Then Hipparchia, the woman who saw through convention and chose a life beneath the stars. A few others. Never many. Never for long. The world doesn't have much patience for people who demand honesty instead of comfort. You always knew it would be misused. That one day, long after your jar was gone, people would confuse cynicism with bitterness, mistake truth-telling for cruelty, or reduce your life to a list of stunts told at dinner parties. You knew your name would be smoothed into caricature, but that was fine. You didn't need to be remembered correctly, only uncomfortably. And even now, long after the temples have crumbled, long after the forums have turned to ruin, there are still moments when your presence returns. Not in libraries, not in classrooms, but in sudden flashes when someone says something too honest at a wedding, or walks barefoot into a building with gold walls, or refuses to bow, even when it would be easier to kneel. That's your legacy. Not a school, not a method, but a refusal. You didn't invent cynicism, but you gave it a face, a voice, a jar. And as we turn to the strangest stories you left behind, the myths wrapped around your real life, the ones too odd to fully believe, we carry with us that core idea that maybe the only honest way to live is the one that scares everyone else just a little bit. You never really mind what they call you. Madman, philosopher, joke, prophet, parasite. The names change depending on how close someone gets to the truth. For every person who laughs at your antics or crosses the street to avoid the smell of your unwashed cloak, there's another who stares just a little too long, wondering whether what you're doing is insanity, or a kind of genius too raw for polite minds to swallow. You never correct them. What would be the point? Madness and wisdom share the same eyes if you tilt your head just right. Sometimes you think it must be madness to live like this, to sleep without a roof, to go without shoes in winter, to eat onions like apples, letting the skin tear your eyes open. You can't deny the discomfort, the cold, the hunger. There are nights the wind punches through your cloak like a thief, and mornings your joints crack like broken tiles. You wake with aches that don't have names, bites from creatures you never saw. You smell like the city's forgotten corners. That can't be wise, can it? And yet, what is sanity but a kind of consensus? A mutual agreement to behave within certain lines, to accept certain illusions so everyone can function without screaming. You saw it long ago, in the way people nod at lies just to keep conversation smooth. You saw it in the markets, where men haggled over luxuries, while beggars died 10 steps away. You saw it in temples, in law courts, in philosophy schools. A madness dressed up in robes, scented with incense, trimmed with gold. If that's sanity, you think you'll take the other thing. They whisper about you like a legend now. Some say you once bit a man who tried to remove you from the steps of the temple. Others swear you barked through an entire funeral just to protest the cost of the marble coffin. One man claimed you spent a full day meowing like a cat outside a symposium until someone offered you wine, and you replied, "Finally, someone who hears without needing words?" Are all the stories true? You're not sure anymore. You've told so many half-truths with a straight face, and they've been retold so often that the edges have blurred. But you like it that way. You've become a moving target, impossible to label, impossible to pin down. Every once in a while, someone tries. A philosopher might confront you in the marketplace, full of dignity and well-oiled beard, and challenge you with clever questions. Is this not merely performance? Are you not just playing the fool? You stare back and say nothing. Or you fart. Or you eat a raw onion until tears stream down your face. Either way, they leave confused. You don't argue with people who still think arguments are the way to truth. You show them something they can't explain instead. You know what they're really asking when they talk about madness. They're asking, how can someone give up everything? Why choose squalor over safety? Why spit on wealth, refuse comfort, and live like a creature when you have the mind of a scholar? You want to ask them back, what makes them cling so tightly to things that never last? Why wear shoes that blister? Why sleep on pillows that rob the spine? Why chase status like a bone tied to a stick? Who's the madman here? Some days, you find the question amusing. Other days, you wonder if there really is a line between madness and clarity, or if it only looks that way from inside a warm house. You once said that if you see someone running toward pleasure or wealth, as if their life depends on it, then you've already seen a form of madness. But say the same about a man curled in a jar, refusing an audience with kings, and suddenly, it's scandal. They want you to fit into their categories, and you won't. They want you to be either lunatic or sage, either clown or prophet. You keep giving them both. That's why they remember you. Not because you shouted louder, but because you shattered the frame. Most philosophers want to be quoted. You wanted to be misunderstood, just enough to stay dangerous. You do wonder, sometimes in the quiet hours before sunrise, whether you've pushed it too far, whether the city has begun to forget what you're saying beneath the stunts. You've seen children mimic your gestures without understanding the reason. You've heard drunks bark in your name. You've watched admirers turn your insults into slogans, your gestures into rituals. There's irony in that, you suppose. They're trying to preserve the message by repeating the method, not realizing the message was about destroying repetition itself. Still, you persist. Not because you're certain, but because the question must stay alive. A world that no longer asks whether the madman is wise, or whether the wise man is mad, has already gone numb. You are here to irritate the skin of that numbness, to wake it with rudeness, to sting it with contradiction. If they stop talking about you, then you failed. But if they're still arguing, still doubting, still offended, then perhaps there's hope. One day, a child sits beside your jar and watches you eat with your hands. He doesn't speak. He doesn't flinch. He only studies you, eyes curious, mouth shut. After a while, he asks, "Are you pretending?" You shake your head. "Are they?" you ask. He doesn't answer, but he returns the next day, and the day after that. Not with questions, just to sit. That's when you know the line between wisdom and madness isn't fixed. It bends like sunlight through a cracked window. It shifts depending on who's asking, and whether they've taken their shoes off before they ask it. In a city where the wise are often bought, and the mad are quietly locked away, you've become something else entirely. A wild, inconvenient mirror. And as the years turn and your beard grows wild, as the rumors spread and the insults pile like fruit in the market, You remain content to be the man no one can agree on, the man who sleeps in public and questions everything, even the words meant to praise him. Because in the end, the only real madness would be to stop asking questions at all. There's one more tale the city tells, and whether it's true or not doesn't really matter. They say that when a wealthy man once offered you a home, clean clothes, and a place at his table, you paused only a moment before replying, "I already eat with the gods." Then you picked a scrap from the street and walked away, leaving the man speechless and your legend a little more complicated. And so we wander now toward that complicated legend, with the strange and the sacred blend. Toward stories that blur fact and myth, but always circle back to a question. What does it mean to live freely? And who gets to decide where freedom begins? In the wide, sun-bleached streets of Athens, the question of freedom is everywhere, though few dare to ask it plainly. It's stitched into the folds of every toga, whispered in the silences between boasts at the symposium, and woven into the anxious glances of those trying not to be seen wanting. But you, barefoot and cloaked only in nerve, carry the question openly, dragging it like a threadbare banner through the city's most sacred spaces. And that, more than your smell or your stunts, is what unsettles them. Freedom, in the way the Athenians speak of it, sounds straightforward. A citizen is free. A slave is not. A man who votes, owns land, speaks in the assembly, he is free. But those definitions stretch thin the closer you look. A citizen's freedom depends on property, birth, and the favor of the crowd. His speech is calculated, lest he offend the wrong magistrate. His wealth shackles him to rituals. His marriage to family alliances. His power to public expectation. They say he is free. But what he really is careful. You, by contrast, are careless in the way a fire is careless. You do not own land, yet go wherever you please. You do not vote, but people remember what you say. You speak without permission and act without apology. You refuse the markers of freedom the city worships, and in doing so, you reveal how hollow they've become. You don't wear your liberty like a garland at a festival. You wear it like a stain no one can wash away. Someone once asked you, "Are you free because you sleep in a jar?" You scratched your chest and said, "No, I'm free because I don't mind where I sleep." It's not the lack of possessions that makes you free. It's the absence of need. Most men scramble to build walls around themselves, walls of wealth, of status, of routine. They think safety and control are the same thing. But you understand that every wall is also a prison, and the only real freedom is indifference to walls. They try to define you by the things you lack. You lack a home, a profession, a family, a reputation. But that's their error. They measure freedom by what a man has, not by what he can live without. You could walk into a palace and leave with nothing but your shadow, and still feel unburdened. They, however, would panic if a sandal strap broke. What frightens people isn't your poverty. It's your immunity. You have made yourself immune to shame, to fear, to ambition. That kind of person can't be bribed, can't be threatened, can't be flattered. You're not a rebel, not in the way armies are. You're a refusal, a walking no to the illusions they hold dear. And there is no greater threat to a system than someone who simply opts out without anger, without violence, just a shrug and a fart. You've noticed how the rich always come with conditions. A man with property is bound to taxes. A man with a reputation must guard it. A man with slaves fears rebellion. They all live under invisible weights, while you carry only a cloak and a bowl. Some see that and call you crazy. Others, more quietly, wonder if you've figured something out that they're too afraid to name. Sometimes they offer you things: food, money, a house. You take the food when hungry, the coins when you feel playful, and reject the house with a smile. You don't refuse because you enjoy the cold. You refuse because every gift has a hook. Accept too much, and you start to lean. Lean too long, and you forget how to stand without support. One afternoon, a wealthy man offers you a villa. You ask, "Can I defecate in the courtyard?" He recoils, of course. So you thank him for confirming that his gift came with rules. You don't want a palace that behaves like a leash. You'd rather sleep in the street and answer to no one. Not even gratitude should be owed. That's the lesson no one teaches in the schools. Freedom isn't granted, it's claimed. And claiming it often looks impolite, even insane. But you've lived long enough to see the difference between the man who serves his image and the one who serves nothing at all. The first calls himself free. The second simply is. One morning, you pass a young orator rehearsing a speech. His robe is fine, his hair oiled, his voice crisp. He speaks of liberty, of the glories of democracy, of the rights of the Athenian man. You interrupt to ask, "Can you say these things naked in winter while being pelted with fish bones?" He says no. You say, "Then your freedom depends on costume and applause. Mine depends on neither." He does not finish his speech. What you've built is not a model life. You wouldn't wish your path on most. It's lonely. It's cold. It's misunderstood. But it's also unchained. And that, for you, is enough. You've seen too many men polish their cages and call the shine liberty. The guards still glare at you. The priests still avoid you. The philosophers still debate whether you're mad or brilliant. And yet, people keep gathering when you speak. Not because they agree, but because they feel something shift when you open your mouth. A discomfort, a suspicion, a crack in the stone. You once told a crowd, "I have nothing. Therefore, I have everything." Most of them laughed. A few nodded. Fewer still understood. That's fine. You're not trying to be understood by the crowd. You're speaking to the few who've already started to question their chains. And now, as we step from the sun-scorched plazas into shaded marble courtyards, we'll see what your life looked like through the eyes of those who had everything to lose. Men who owned mansions, slaves, and schools, and yet couldn't bear the sound of your sandals slapping the marble outside their gates. Because nothing, in all their luxury, disturbed them more than a man who wanted none of it. The invitation, as always, is non-existent. You weren't sent for, summoned, or slipped a wax-sealed scroll, but that's never mattered. In Athens, food is a public affair as much as a private one. And when a man roasts lamb beneath a tiled roof and sends wine flowing like the Aegean, he's also sending out a scent trail. You follow it easily, through alleyways clotted with clay, past fig sellers asleep on their stalls, down into the polished quarters, where the air smells less like people and more like roses, oil, and the faint metallic sting of silver goblets left too long in sunlit courtyards. They spot you immediately, not because you shout or gesture, though you might, but because you radiate offense. No sandals, no invitation, no regard for the threshold that marks inside from out. You cross it like a stray dog might. Bold, hungry, unapologetic. The host's eyes twitch. The doorman looks uncertain. You sit directly on the floor. No cushion, no greeting. Just the scraping of your knees against marble and the faint smell of dust that trails behind you like a challenge. You do not blend in. You do not attempt to. The table gleams under candlelight. Plates are full, mouths half full, and conversation about empire, about balance, about ideal virtue is flowing like a well-fed stream. Wine glows in shallow cups. Fingers sparkle with rings. A lyre plays something forgettable. Laughter hovers at the ready, rehearsed and cautious. Everything is in its place. And then there's you. You pluck a fig from the host's platter and devour it like a man who hasn't been to a banquet in his life, which is exactly the case. Chewing with your mouth open, you examine each man in turn, like one might study a coin to see whether it's silver or just polished bronze. Some return the look. Most don't. They avoid your eyes. The way people avoid catching the eye of something that bites. Then someone says it. Always the same phrase, just dressed in different cloaks. You again. Yes, you reply, spitting a seed to the floor. Me again. Athens still has food. And lies. I eat the first. I bark at the second. A servant begins to move toward you, perhaps to ask you to leave. You raise your cloak just slightly, revealing your scrawny legs and bare feet. It's not a threat. It's a reminder. You've got nothing to lose. That makes you heavier than any man reclining here. You listen for a while. One guest compares democracy to a ship. Another quotes Plato, something about the soul's three parts. Someone else pontificates on virtue and balance and the noble spirit. You lift your hand slowly. May I ask, you say, how many of you wiped your own behinds today? The laughter that follows is brittle, like clay left too long in the kiln. A few pretend not to hear. One guest looks genuinely offended. Another looks curious, which is worse. The host clears his throat. Diogenes, we are discussing higher matters tonight. So am I, you say, licking your fingers. What's higher than knowing which end of a man is clean? A younger man, not yet bored of his own thoughts, tries to challenge you. What is your purpose here? You insult the host, you mock the guests. Do you think this is virtue? You consider, watching him as you scratch your arm with exaggerated flair. I think, you say, that a banquet that can be ruined by truth was never that fine to begin with. Another guest, older, lean as a dried fish, leans forward and asks, would you say then that the rich are less virtuous than the poor? You smile. I'd say the poor can't afford as many masks. There's a moment where no one quite knows whether to chuckle or take offense. You enjoy this space, where social rules curl like old parchment in the fire. You don't have to say much. Your presence alone makes everyone reevaluate how they hold their goblets, how they lean on cushions, how often they've spoken today without saying anything. You point at a golden dish in the center of the table. That, you say, has more dignity than the man who refuses to eat it unless the room applauds his manners. A few heads turn. One man begins to mutter about the sanctity of the symposium. You burp loudly in response. The muttering stops. A slave girl passes behind you, carrying a pitcher of wine. You ask her, do they drink more when they talk, or talk more when they drink? She snorts, quietly, and keeps walking. The guests pretend not to notice, but you saw her smile. This is why you come. Not just for the food, though that's welcome. Not for the spectacle, though that's amusing. You come because this is where Athens polishes its hypocrisy, and you like to leave smudges. No one invites you. No one thanks you. But no one forgets you either. And in a city bursting with marble statues of forgettable men, that is a kind of immortality. When the host finally stands to offer a toast, you interrupt. To all the dogs who never begged to be patted, a few cups clink. A few don't. You rise before anyone asks you to leave. It's better that way. Not because you mind rejection, but because you prefer to leave with your cloak unwrinkled and your dignity fully intact, unlike their illusions. As you step back into the cold air, the sound of string music fades behind you. The streets are quieter now, less perfumed, more honest. You pass a dog chewing a lamb bone. You sit beside it. No words, no rituals. Just two creatures enjoying what they found. And now, from the drunken banquet halls and nervous symposiums, we'll follow your echo through the stone corridors of philosophy itself, where men build castles of words while pretending to have cleaned their own stables. You've never needed scrolls or schools. You've only needed a question sharp enough to make the wise look foolish. You don't hate the smell of perfume. You understand its purpose. Lavender for the wrists, myrrh for the throat, a dab of frankincense on the robes when company is expected. It all makes sense, in a way. People in this city want to seem pleasant. They want to hide the animal beneath the silk. But you've never had the luxury of hiding much of anything. Not your body, not your hunger, not your opinion, and certainly not your smell. You wear your poverty like a second skin, and it carries its own scent. Earthy, sharp, honest. The rich move through Athens like walking censers, trailed by plumes of cedarwood and spikenard, like priests of their own self-importance. Their bodies are scrubbed by slaves until they shine, and anointed with oils imported across mountains and seas. They think this is civilization. You think it's theater. In fact, you've said so aloud, more than once, standing barefoot in a fish stall while a perfumed noble passes by, nose wrinkled like he's sniffed something rotting. That's just me, you tell him. Smells like freedom. You've seen what perfume really does. It's a disguise, a scented smokescreen, an attempt to suppress the truth that the human body is a leaking, gasping, sweating thing. No amount of saffron oil or rose essence can change that. And yet, they try. They perfume their flesh the way they perfume their politics, to mask the stench of what's really happening underneath. You live differently. You wash when it rains. You dry in the sun. You scrub your hands with sand if it's there, or dirt if it's not. And when someone asks why you don't bathe like a respectable man, you shrug. What's the point? You say, I'll stink again by morning. The same can't be said for their dignity. Once lost, it tends not to return. There was a time, once, when you tried to walk cleanly through the world, when you wore a decent robe, took careful steps, even bothered to rinse your face in the public fountain before speaking. But it didn't change anything. They still called you mad. They still laughed. It was only when you stopped pretending that you began to feel whole, when you let the dust settle into your skin, when you stopped apologizing for the smell of being human. They say poverty stinks, and yes, it does, but not nearly as much as pretense. You've sat outside banquets, downwind of roasted meat and wine, and watched men with perfumed foreheads debate virtue while ignoring the beggar at their gate. Their hypocrisy smells worse than your feet ever could. There's something else too, something deeper. Perfume isn't just about hiding filth. It's about status. In Athens, only the well-off can afford to smell like orchards and spice caravans. To be perfumed is to declare, I have enough to waste. It's a way of marking territory without lifting a finger. You, of course, mark territory with your words, with your stare, with the way you settle cross-legged in the middle of a street and become impossible to ignore. Once you followed a nobleman for half an hour, all through the agora, asking loudly whether his sandal straps were scented too. You know, you said, if the soles smell good, maybe your footprints will finally lead to something worthwhile. He did not respond, but he did walk faster. Your smell precedes you. You know that. People turn their heads as you pass, not just because you're half naked and muttering about dogs, but because you don't blend in. You never have. You never tried. In a city where everyone is sculpting their image, you are the crack in the statue, the sour wind that reminds them that no matter how polished they look, there's still flesh underneath. Flesh that dies, flesh that rots, flesh that, sooner or later, will smell just like yours. You've turned this into philosophy. Of course you have. You're Diogenes. You once said, if only it were as easy to banish hunger by rubbing the belly as it is to banish odor by rubbing the skin. The joke landed. They laughed nervously, but they didn't forget it. And now, the city knows you by your scent as much as your sayings. You are unclean, unfiltered, unavoidable. A walking rejection of every standard they've tried to impose. You've weaponized discomfort. When you sit too close to a nobleman on a bench, he flinches, not just because you smell like the riverbed in August, but because you remind him that comfort is a fragile, borrowed thing. Still, even you sometimes notice beauty. Late at night, Walking past a house with perfumed gardens, you pause. Just briefly. The scent of hyacinth catches in your nose, and you don't sneer. You just breathe. You remember, perhaps, that the world is not only a place of lies and vanity. Sometimes it is fragrant for no reason. And sometimes, even the smelliest philosopher is allowed to like a flower. But then a thought creeps in. Whose hands watered those blossoms? Whose coins bought the seeds? You walk on. Your smell, your hunger, your grime, they've become your armor. Not because you can't do better, but because you won't pretend. And that's the one sin Athens can't forgive. Not filth, not nudity, not even theft, but refusal. The refusal to play along. That's what galls them most. And so you keep walking barefoot across their polished courtyards, leaving behind smudges on stone and scowls on faces. You scratch your beard in public, sneeze in debate, and remind the powdered philosophers that truth doesn't always come wearing clean robes. From the grit of your own unwashed skin, you move towards smoother surfaces now, not in search of comfort, but confrontation. The next place you visit smells nothing like you. It smells like marble dust, olive oil, and self-importance. And in that space, lined with statues and soft-spoken scholars, you will do what you always do. Arrive uninvited, sit unwashed, and challenge everything that dares to call itself virtuous. Virtue has a wardrobe in Athens. It wears silk chittons with gold thread trim. It reclines on ivory couches while sipping cooled wine. And it quotes poetry under vine-covered porticos, as if truth itself only blooms near fig trees and silver dishes. The men who speak of the good life do so, while adjusting their rings, smoothing their cloaks, and waving off the flies that would never dare land on someone so carefully arranged. In their hands, virtue has become something ornamental, a fragrant, well-fed concept that never gets dust beneath its nails or sweat beneath its arms. And you, who smell of onions and open skies, are their most unwelcome guest. You've seen them all. The orators with perfect sandals, the philosophers with perfect beards, the magistrates with perfect posture. They talk about justice as they sip from imported cups, and they describe temperance while servants stand waiting to refill their goblets. You once stood outside such a gathering, listening through the open courtyard. One of them said, "The virtuous man is moderate in all things." You scratched your armpit and called in. Even in his honesty? It didn't go over well. A slave tried to chase you away with a broom. You ran circles around him until he gave up. They say you're a scandal. You say they're playing dress up. Their virtue is delicate, fragile, and hopelessly conditional. It works only in rooms with soft cushions and agreeable company. It works only when no one smells bad, or interrupts, or defies the script. You, on the other hand, practice a virtue that holds up in the rain, that survives on bread crusts and public fountains. You don't talk about courage while reclining. You live it, crouched in the street, surrounded by people who'd rather pretend you don't exist. One morning, you wandered into a wealthy man's home uninvited. You weren't trying to steal, just curious. The floor was tiled with little colored stones that glittered like wet beetle shells. There was a silver bowl of fruit on the table, perfect, polished, untouched. The man himself appeared from behind a column and stared at you as if you'd crawled in on 6 legs. You asked him if he was proud of his fruit or his floor. He said both. You said, "Strange. Neither of them have ever helped a hungry man." You aren't impressed by clean surfaces. You don't trust virtue that doesn't stink a little. You think wisdom should come with blisters, that moderation should be tested against real hunger, and that kindness isn't proven until it's shown to someone who hasn't bathed. That's why you turn your back on their silken-robed assemblies and head for the noisy market, where life is cracked open and raw. There's more truth in the calloused hand of a fig seller than in an entire evening of elite symposiums. You've noticed, too, how often they talk about the natural life. The ideal man, the perfect city, the balance of body and soul, all of it supposedly drawn from nature. And yet, none of them seem willing to live as nature intended. They drape themselves in purple dye, sleep on feather-stuffed bedding, and won't touch anything that hasn't been peeled, polished, or placed in a clean dish. You once asked a student of Plato if he'd ever walked barefoot through the mud. He looked confused and asked why anyone would do that. You told him to remember where the ground begins. Your point isn't that comfort is wrong. It's that they mistake comfort for virtue. That they've decided cleanliness is next to godliness, because filth reminds them they're mortal. But you, dog that you are, have made peace with the body. You don't pretend to rise above it. You sit in it, breathe it, accept it. You are the itch in their philosophy, the scent under their silk. They gossip about you while sipping wine from goblets, polished to a mirror shine. They say you live like a beast. You say beasts don't lie. They say your philosophy is crude. You say theirs is covered in perfume and costs too much. And when they finally invite you in, hoping perhaps to civilize or humiliate you, you arrive barefoot and unbrushed and proceed to point out every contradiction in the room. You once told a room full of noblemen that the only honest man among them was the dog curled under the table, licking its own feet. You weren't invited back, but you heard laughter, and you noticed the youngest son of the host followed you outside afterward, asking questions he couldn't ask in front of his father. That's your audience, not the ones in silk, but the ones who suspect it might be choking them. You're not here to win their approval. You're here to make them squirm, not for the sake of discomfort, but for the sake of honesty. You want to remind them that virtue is not something you polish and display. It's something you drag through the dust to see if it still holds up. That's why you squat in their courtyards, call out during their lectures, and nap in the shadows of their columns. Not to destroy their ideals, but to test them. And every so often, one of them passes that test. A boy who sits beside you in the market instead of just tossing you a coin. A woman who brings you leftover bread and doesn't flinch when your fingers brush hers. A slave who listens to your ramblings and laughs, not mockingly, but like someone who understands. Those moments are rare, but they're real, and they matter more than all the scrolls in the libraries of Athens. You've lived so long outside their world of polished perfection that even your shadow is unwelcome in their halls. But that's all right. You found your classroom elsewhere, in the sunlit plaza, in the alleyway where boys wrestle in dust, in the clatter of a fishmonger's stall. That's where your philosophy breathes. Not in silk, but in sweat. And now, as you scratch your chin and prepare to rise from your patch of warm marble, you catch the scent of something softer than soap, more delicate than rose oil, the quiet rustle of slaves arranging a nobleman's banquet. It's time to walk in again, not for a meal, but to remind the perfumed thinkers of what they've forgotten. It starts with the sound of your feet, bare, dusty, deliberate, slapping softly on the clean stone floor as you enter the hall. No announcement, no invitation, just a man in a torn cloak and the scent of open air and spoiled figs. Heads turn slowly, like rusted hinges. A servant hesitates near a wine jug. One guest whispers, "He's here again." You give a little bow, not out of politeness, but mockery. You know what you look like to them, not a guest, not even a curiosity anymore, but a pest. Something that slips in under the door, despite all their careful rules. A walking itch in their banquet of comfort. You aren't insulted by this. In fact, you've leaned into it. Pest is just another word for something they can't ignore. And being ignored, for you, would be the true failure. Your job isn't to be liked. Your job is to prod, poke, disrupt, and remind. They talk of balance, but their balance has come to mean stillness. You're the mosquito buzzing in the ear of their moral complacency, the wasp in the grape bowl, the barking dog that won't stop just because someone's giving a speech on dignity. The philosophers of Athens wear belts of polished bronze and speak with patient, curated clarity. Their sentences unfold like parchment scrolls, deliberate, slow, filled with references to Homer and Heraclitus. When they gesture, it is controlled. When they disagree, it is with furrowed brows and mild laughter. You disagree with snorts, with interruptions, with questions that have dirt under their fingernails. You are the philosopher who doesn't wait his turn. There's an art to being a nuisance. You can't just shout. You have to listen long enough to find the weak spot. That's when you strike. Like the time a polished young man was explaining the 4 cardinal virtues at a symposium. Temperance, courage, justice, wisdom, he said, nodding at each one as if naming his sons. You raised your hand and asked, "If I punch you in the face right now, which virtue should you reach for first?" He didn't answer, but he did avoid you afterward, which felt like a victory. They often accuse you of misunderstanding them, of being too literal, of ignoring nuance. But you don't ignore nuance. You strip it away on purpose. They dress up cowardice as prudence, greed as ambition, vanity as dignity. You take the toga off the word and show the naked idea underneath. It's not elegant, but it's effective. You don't believe in caging truth in polite conversation. You believe in dragging it out into the daylight and letting it squint. Still, there are moments when even you tire of the dance. When you walk into a hall and see the same faces, the same half-lidded eyes, the same smug smiles that haven't changed since the last season. You know their moves now. They brace when you enter. They pretend you amuse them. They try not to look bothered, but they are. They always are. You can smell their discomfort better than their perfume. Sometimes you wish they would just yell, throw a cup, shout what they're really thinking. Why are you here, Diogenes? Why do you always come to destroy? But they won't, because even as they loathe you, they fear appearing petty. You're a test they can't admit they're failing. If they kick you out, they look insecure. If they ignore you, you escalate. If they engage you, they lose. And so, you remain the thorn in the foot of the academy. You once brought a plucked chicken into Plato's lecture and announced, "Behold, Plato's man." You were mocking his definition of man as a featherless biped. It caused such a stir that he had to refine the definition to include with broad, flat nails. You were pleased, not because you bested him, though that was enjoyable, but because it forced someone to think past their abstractions. You believe philosophy should bruise a little, not draw blood, but at least leave a mark. You're not cruel. You don't set out to humiliate. You set out to reveal. And if someone is embarrassed by what they've hidden, that's not your fault. That's the cost of clarity, and clarity is rare in Athens. It's buried beneath customs, performances, rituals, and robes. You peel those away. You arrive with bad manners and worse hygiene, and in doing so, you strip the room bare. Suddenly, the polished philosopher is just a man trying not to breathe too deeply. The noble woman is just someone adjusting her shawl a little tighter. Everyone becomes real again. There's freedom in being the pest. You don't have to impress. You don't have to maintain status. You don't have to nod when someone says something vague, just because they have a following. You are nobody's disciple. You are the echo that answers hollow words with louder ones. The fly in the ointment of well-meaning delusion. And yet, every once in a while, someone hears you. Not just hears, but listens. A student turns his head a little faster. A senator hides a smile. A servant lingers near the doorway, clearly pretending to wipe a spill while catching every word. These are the small victories you don't mention. You leave the gloating to the sophists. They say philosophy is the love of wisdom. You say it's the willingness to be uncomfortable, to laugh when you're wrong, to get muddy, both literally and intellectually. You wear your ideas like your cloak, tattered, honest, and full of air. Let them sit in silence and sip imported truths. You'll be over here, pointing out the termites in the table. And once the last line of verse has been quoted, the last sip of wine taken, and the philosophers begin to retreat to their homes in their musings, you'll slip back outside, into the street, into the cold, dusty clarity of the world. Because your classroom isn't bound by walls, and your teaching doesn't end when the symposium does. There's still one more corner of Athenian life left to visit tonight. The men with sandals too clean to speak to you, and minds too brittle to understand you. Not philosophers this time, but those who claim to govern the city with vision and poise. Let's see what the statesmen make of a dog with a lantern. They prefer polished bronze. That's how the powerful in Athens see themselves, reflected in gleaming shields, ceremonial basins, and the glint of gold worked into their hairpins and sandals. Their lives are surrounded by surfaces that shine, perfect for glimpsing their own carefully arranged features, their proud eyebrows, their aristocratic posture. To them, a mirror is something that flatters. But you are not that kind of mirror. You walk barefoot into their courtyards and legislative halls, like a gust of wind that smells faintly of garlic and sweat. You offer no welcome, no flattery, only clarity. Not the soft-edged reflection they prefer, but the raw one, the kind that points out what their polished bronze won't. The cracked heel beneath the sandal, the tremor in the voice that claims to speak for justice, the quiver of shame behind the marble mask of confidence. You do not distort, but you do not beautify either. And that makes you dangerous. They talk about virtue while reclining on embroidered cushions. They discuss equality while never looking a slave in the eye. They declare justice as a principle, abstract, noble, clean. And you, filthy and scratching your beard with a twig, interrupt all of it by simply being present. No prepared speech. No scroll. Just a body that refuses to play by their rules. And when they call you a pest, you smile. Because even vermin have the power to disrupt a feast. You remember one particular morning in the colonnade, when a group of young officials were debating laws concerning public decency. Their hands moved in practiced rhythm, punctuating statements with lifted fingers and pensive tilts of the head. A healthy city, one declared, must cultivate decorum. You waited until he turned your direction, then scratched your rear loudly and yawned. Decorum doesn't fill an empty stomach, you replied, but it does make hypocrisy look presentable. The silence that followed was delicious. The thing they hate most is that you do not apologize. You don't pretend to be less than what you are. You don't bow your head in the presence of rank or titles. You don't correct your language or lower your gaze. You are the proof that not all men can be molded into statues. And it bothers them, because if one dog can ignore the rules, what stops others from doing the same? You once told a magistrate that his finest speech could be undone by a hungry man with a question. He didn't laugh. He had you dragged away, but not before you told the crowd, "The beating I receive will outlast every word he spoke." And you were right. Days later, children were still whispering your lines, giggling as they mimicked your walk and smeared dirt across their faces in tribute. In another city, perhaps you'd be a criminal, or a madman locked behind temple walls. But Athens, strange and brilliant as it is, has carved a small corner for you. It despises you and needs you in equal measure, because every lie it tells about itself needs a counterweight. And you, with your fleas and your brutal honesty, have become that weight. They may not listen, but they notice. And when they lie awake at night, shifting on their linen sheets, some of them remember the questions you asked. The old men especially avoid your gaze. They have lived long enough to remember who they used to be. You see it in their eyes when you call out their contradictions. Once, one of them even nodded, just slightly, before quickly looking away. He had been a student once. Maybe he had read Socrates and meant it. Now he writes laws for people he doesn't visit and quotes justice like it's a prayer instead of a responsibility. You stand before them like a dirty oracle, not predicting the future, but revealing the present. You tell them what their slaves think, what their wives whisper, what their sons don't dare say in the daylight. You are not holy, not divine, not even especially pleasant, but you are real. More real than the statues lining the council chamber. More honest than the robes draped across every lie. And you don't just disrupt with words. Your body is an argument. Your hunger is a counterpoint. Your scars are citations. Every time they see you curled beneath a public fountain, or eating an onion with both hands like a dog with a bone, it gnaws at them. Not because you suffer, but because you survive. Because you are not supposed to. Their system isn't built for you, and yet you persist, thriving in its blind spots, growing louder in its margins. Once, during a state festival, they erected a temporary stage where poets recited verses about Athens' greatness. You walked in front of the crowd and loudly defecated just behind the curtains. When they screamed at you, you shrugged and said, "I am merely contributing to the foundations." The priest who chased you swore for 10 minutes straight, but people laughed. Some of them too hard, some of them nervously. All of them remembered. You don't play fair because you don't believe the game is fair. And you know something they forget. Shame is a tool of power. They use it to keep people quiet, to keep the streets orderly, the words scripted, the truth diluted. But you, dog that you are, shed shame like a second skin. You live without it, weaponize its absence, and use it to expose just how much everyone else depends on it to feel civilized. You often think that if virtue were a man, he wouldn't wear perfume or gold. He'd stink. He'd walk slowly and trip over his own cloak. He'd sleep on the steps of the courthouse and speak with a cracked voice. He'd be you, or something like you. And perhaps that's why they hate you most of all. Because they know that real virtue isn't beautiful. It's uncomfortable, and it doesn't sell well at the Agora. And still, you return. Every morning, every gathering, every ceremony. You are the ugly mirror they cannot shatter. Even if they avert their eyes, they still see the outline of their reflection. They still hear the echo of your bark. Now, as the crowds thin and the last official retreats behind a stone column, you wander toward the outer edge of the city. There, among the half-carved statues and discarded marble blocks, lies the sanctuary of sculptors, those who chisel beauty from rock and try to make permanence out of dust. A final contrast awaits. You, the unshaped man, stepping among gods of cold perfection. They speak of Socrates with reverence, of Plato with admiration, of Aristotle with pride. Their names are uttered in marble halls, carved into the lintels of libraries, whispered reverently in academies as if invoking old gods. They left systems, doctrines, methods. Their ideas are organized like temples, built to last, symmetrical, pleasing to the intellectual eye. They founded schools, shaped states, and outlined the very foundations of logic and ethics. You, on the other hand, left behind none of that. No school bears your name. No state traces its constitution to your philosophies. No reverent procession carries wreaths to your memory. And truthfully, you'd find all that quite embarrassing. Your legacy is not carved into marble, but scratched into the corner of a wine jar. It doesn't sit on polished scrolls. It lingers in uncomfortable questions, in the kind of laughter that breaks out at a funeral, because someone finally told the truth. And yet, somehow, you endure. No monuments, no pupils, no empire of the mind. And still, your name persists, not because it soothes, but because it rankles, because it refuses to disappear. The philosophers who came after, who tried to explain you away, they built neat categories around your chaos, fashioned tidy doctrines from your wild gestures. Cynicism, they called it, as if you were the founder of something respectable, something that could be taught in orderly lessons to well-scrubbed students. But you weren't founding anything. You were demolishing everything. There's a difference between creating a philosophy and living one so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from your breath. Zeno of Citium heard your stories and tried to build something cleaner from them, Stoicism. They called his creation noble, disciplined, respectable, the kind of philosophy that could be practiced by senators and emperors without embarrassing anyone at dinner parties. He took your contempt for luxury and turned it into moderation. He took your indifference to social approval and transformed it into inner tranquility. He borrowed your lamp and polished it until it gleamed like a proper philosophical instrument. But something was lost in translation. The wildness, the laughter, the sheer audacious joy of watching a pompous man's face crumble when confronted with his own absurdity. Zeno's followers could meditate on virtue while sitting in comfortable rooms. You practiced it by sleeping rough and eating whatever scraps the dogs wouldn't touch. They spoke of wisdom. You lived it with your skin exposed to every element, your dignity traded for truth. The Romans, when they eventually encountered your legend, were particularly baffled. They admired discipline, hierarchy, the orderly progression from citizen to senator to consul. They built roads that ran straight for hundreds of miles, aqueducts that defied gravity, laws that organized human behavior into neat categories. Your philosophy, if it could be called that, ran like water through their fingers. How do you systematize chaos? How do you institutionalize rebellion? Some tried. Epictetus, born a slave, found in your stories a kind of freedom that no master could revoke. He taught that external circumstances couldn't touch the inner self, that a man in chains could be freer than his captor. But even he cleaned up your message, made it palatable for students who needed hope rather than provocation. He kept your core insight that most of what we think we need is actually imprisonment, but wrapped it in gentler language. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, wrote his meditations while campaigning on distant frontiers, trying to reconcile your teachings with the responsibilities of ruling an empire. In his private notebooks, he wrestled with the contradiction. How does one hold power while rejecting its importance? How does one govern a world one has learned to see as fundamentally absurd? His answers were thoughtful, measured, dignified. You would have laughed at all three qualities. Those who try to follow in your footsteps often do so in sandals far too clean. A few students read your stories in the soft candlelight of their studies and feel a thrill. They dream of tossing aside their possessions, rejecting the polite hypocrisies of their city, living on the edge like a wandering sage with nothing but a cloak and a biting tongue. But when the floor is cold, when the figs are rotten, when the laughter turns to sneers, they retreat. Because your path, your real path, isn't glamorous. It's humiliating. It's lonely. It asks too much. Not just that you give everything up, but that you laugh while doing it. A modern world has been even less kind to your memory, though it's tried harder to claim you. Self-help gurus quote your sayings while selling expensive seminars on radical simplicity. Minimalism movements invoke your name while designing aesthetically pleasing empty rooms for people wealthy enough to choose their deprivations. Instagram philosophers post pictures of sunrise meditations accompanied by your supposed wisdom, carefully curated for maximum inspiration and minimum discomfort. They've turned you into a lifestyle brand. The irony would amuse you if irony could reach the dead. You, who mocked every form of performance, have become the ultimate performance. People practice voluntary poverty as a form of spiritual luxury, giving up possessions while keeping their safety nets, the return tickets to comfort. They want your freedom without your hunger, your honesty without your homelessness, your wisdom without your wounds. But there are still those who catch glimpses of the real thing. The teenager who walks away from college because the whole enterprise suddenly seems like an elaborate pretense. The executive who quits mid-presentation because she can no longer pretend the meeting matters. The artist who burns his paintings because he realizes he's been creating for applause rather than truth. These moments of recognition, of sudden clarity, that cuts through years of accumulated nonsense. These are your true inheritance. To live like you did is to give up not only wealth but vanity, not only shelter but praise. You didn't ask the world to listen. You barked at it, nipped its heels, and dared it to ignore you. That's not a legacy people want to inherit. That's a mirror they want to turn face down. The stories that survive about you aren't the kind that inspire founding myths or national holidays. They're too sharp, too uncomfortable, too immediate. When Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, found you lounging in the sun and asked what favor he could grant you, you told him to step aside because he was blocking your light. The story doesn't end with Alexander learning humility or you gaining a powerful patron. It ends with you going back to your nap and Alexander walking away, reportedly saying he would choose to be Diogenes if he could not be Alexander. But he could not make that choice, and you would not have respected him if he had. This is what makes your tales so persistently irritating to civilized people. They don't resolve. They don't offer neat lessons about virtue rewarded or wisdom recognized. They simply present moments of pure, uncompromising honesty, like lightning strikes that briefly illuminate the landscape before leaving everyone stumbling in deeper darkness. And yet your stories remain. The boy with the bowl who taught you to drink from your hands. The time you stood naked in the marketplace to test your own shame. The moment you told the most powerful man on earth to stop blocking your sunlight. These tales are not parables. They don't resolve neatly. They don't offer comfort. What they offer is a sharp edge, a sudden jolt of honesty. A reminder that philosophy doesn't have to wear a clean robe or keep quiet at dinner. The boy with the bowl. That story alone contains more philosophy than most treatises. You thought you had achieved the ultimate simplicity, owning nothing but a cloak, a staff, and a wooden bowl. Then you saw a child drinking from cupped hands and realized you were still carrying one possession too many. You threw away the bowl immediately, not with regret, but with laughter at your own pretension. Most philosophers would have written a book about this revelation, analyzing the relationship between need and desire, the nature of sufficiency, the stages of spiritual development. You just threw away the bowl and walked on. Your nakedness in the marketplace wasn't exhibitionism or madness, though that's how the comfortable chose to interpret it. It was a philosophical experiment conducted on your own flesh. If shame is just social conditioning, if dignity is merely agreement to play by arbitrary rules, then what happens when you refuse to play? You stood there exposed, not to shock people, but to test whether anything essential changed when the clothes came off. The answer, as you discovered, was no. The same thoughts moved through your head, the same sensations through your body. Only other people's comfort changed, which proved your point about whose problem shame really was. These weren't stunts performed for attention. They were investigations conducted with the only laboratory you trusted, your own life. Every action was a hypothesis tested against reality. Every gesture a question posed to the universe. The universe, characteristically, never answered directly, but your experiments accumulated into a kind of wisdom anyway, or at least into a kind of clarity about what wisdom wasn't. You became, in time, less a man and more a rumor. A figure passed along in tavern tales and whispered through the halls of students, more comfortable with ideas than actions. Some scholars tried to clean you up, to turn you into a symbol of stoic virtue or minimalist living. But the truth is, you weren't simple. You weren't clean. You were deliberately messy. You were a disruption that refused to be classified. The scholars particularly annoyed you when they were alive, and they continue to misunderstand you in death. They want to place you in the neat progression of philosophical thought, pre-Socratic to Socratic to post-Socratic, thesis to antithesis to synthesis. But you were never part of any progression. You were a sideways step, a tangent that led nowhere anyone wanted to follow. You didn't build on previous philosophers. You trampled through their gardens, pointing out that their carefully cultivated ideas were weeds growing wild all along. When the Christian era arrived, some of its thinkers found your example useful for their own purposes. Here was a man who had given up everything for truth, who had lived without possessions or comforts, who had endured mockery and persecution for his convictions. They tried to make you into a proto-saint, a pagan preview of Christian virtue. But your motivation was all wrong for their purposes. You didn't suffer for love of humanity or hope of divine reward. You suffered because you found the alternative, comfortable lies, unbearable. Your asceticism wasn't pious. It was practical. You discovered that most of what people thought they needed was actually making them miserable, so you stopped carrying it. That's what makes your legacy so peculiar. It lives not in followers, but in friction, in the awkward pause after someone repeats your words, in the red face of a politician interrupted by an inconvenient truth, in the moment when a man dressed in silk begins to doubt whether his life has been shaped by choice or by fear of appearing foolish. Your influence moves through history like an underground river, surfacing in unexpected places. The medieval mystics who gave away their wealth and wandered barefoot through Europe, seeking truth in poverty and solitude. The Renaissance artists who walked away from patronage to paint what they saw rather than what was commissioned. The Enlightenment satirists who used laughter as a weapon against pomposity and pretense. None of them claimed descent from you, but they carried something forward that you had planted. The recognition that most of human misery is optional, chosen out of habit rather than necessity. There have been others like you, scattered across time. Tricksters in the courts of kings, mad prophets on street corners, unwashed agitators whose presence was tolerated only because it could not be controlled. They never last long in the spotlight. They're rarely welcomed at banquets, but they don't vanish either. They linger, not in triumph, but in irritation. And irritation, as it turns out, is its own kind of legacy. The Chinese had Zhuangzi, who dreamed he was a butterfly and woke uncertain which was the dream. The Indians had Nagarjuna, who proved that everything was empty and laughed at his own proof. The Japanese had Ikkyu, who wrote poetry in brothels and served tea to beggars. Different cultures, different centuries, but the same essential recognition that taking life too seriously was the first step toward taking it not seriously enough. But you were peculiarly Greek in your approach to this universal insight. The Greeks believed in arete, excellence, virtue, the full realization of potential. You achieved this through deliberate degradation, reaching excellence by rejecting every external measure of it. You were the most virtuous man in Athens precisely because you cared least about appearing virtuous. You achieved the greatest freedom by owning nothing. You gained the most respect by refusing to seek it. This paradox is what your contemporaries couldn't stomach and what history has struggled to digest. How do you honor someone who rejected honor? How do you memorialize someone who would have found memorials embarrassing? The answer, apparently, is badly and with great discomfort. You weren't trying to build a future. You were trying to tear away illusions in the present. And while no school was founded in your name, a certain kind of thinking did carry forward. Cynicism, they call it now, though even that has been tamed. Once it meant living against convention, stripping life to its barest truths, finding freedom in defiance. Now it often means smugness, skepticism without action, a sneer without sacrifice. They borrowed your name, but not your courage. Modern cynicism is what happens when your insights are separated from your commitment. It's easy to see through social pretenses. It's hard to live as if that seeing through mattered. Contemporary cynics pride themselves on not being fooled, but they've made a new kind of foolishness out of their very sophistication. They know everything is absurd, but can't bring themselves to laugh. They see through every pretense, but won't risk the embarrassment of being genuine. They've kept your doubt, but discarded your joy. Still, echoes remain. In every teenager who questions why things are the way they are. In every artist who walks away from applause. In every voice that challenges comfort with raw, unfiltered truth. You aren't always named, but you're there, like a cracked foundation beneath a palace, or the bark of a stray dog echoing through a marble hallway at night. The echoes are strongest in the moments when someone suddenly sees through their own performance. The businessman who realizes his career is an elaborate way of avoiding any real work. The academic who discovers she's been studying life instead of living it. The politician who catches himself believing his own speeches. These moments of recognition, when the gap between public role and private reality becomes too wide to ignore, these are your true resurrections. You are not a hero. You are not a martyr. You are a thorn. A presence that reminds us how thin the line is between civilization and performance, between honesty and obedience, between virtue and vanity. And in that, perhaps, you found the closest thing to immortality. Now the city dims. The sun has vanished behind the rooftops, and the statues, those proud, frozen images of gods and ideal men, are turning pale in the dusk. Somewhere behind them, behind the scrolls and incense, behind the polite laughter of symposiums and the hush of polished courtyards, your jar sits quietly, empty. Or maybe not. Maybe it holds more than it seems. The jar has become a symbol, though you would have mocked symbols as another form of possession. Still, it endures in the imagination. A vessel that contained nothing and therefore could hold everything. A home that wasn't a home, owned by someone who owned nothing, housing a philosophy that wasn't a philosophy. The perfect container for a life that refused to be contained. A breeze brushes the dust down the alleyway. A dog pads silently along the colonnade. A man sleeping on stone mutters something in his sleep, a crooked smile still lingering on his face. We've walked the strange road beside you, followed your bare feet through grime and sunlight, watched you snarl at kings and scratch at philosophers. And now, as the lights go out and the night settles in, it's time to let go of the cloak, the onion, the lamp. Time to leave the laughter and defiance in their rightful place, beneath the stars. Let's ease gently into the close of our journey, as the dogs return to their corners and the world forgets, just briefly, how it's supposed to behave. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the dust-blown corners of the Athenian market to the shaded gardens where philosophers argued about forms, from a sunlit patch of stone beside a half-empty jar to the startled hush that follows an honest insult, it's been a long, slow walk through the barefoot life of a man who tried to live without lies. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the barked laughter at a symposium and the rustle of a stolen fig leaf in the Agra, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole idea. If you enjoyed this quieter, sleep-friendly walk through ancient history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. Drop it in the comments. It's always lovely to see how far these calm little stories can travel. For now, I'll let the dogs settle into their corners, the oil lamps flicker low beside cold marble columns, and the strange legacy of a man with nothing, except his honesty, fade gently into the night. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.